Be careful, stranger. Do not go in there.
Last Half of Darkness is the name given to a series of shareware and indie horror games developed by WRF Studios and released between 1989 and 2011. The series mostly adheres to the conventions of the point-and-click adventure genre, and consists of 4 MS-DOS titles, an online browser game, and another 4 adventures released for Windows operating systems in the mid to late 2000s. The first episode, released in 1989, was a graphic adventure in which players had to solve the mystery of a haunted manor, a house of horrors where death was always but a single click away. The second part of Last Half of Darkness arrived in 1992, using very similar mechanics as the first but adding new puzzles and mini-games, from an underground labyrinth to a game of cards against Death himself. The third and final episode in the DOS trilogy was released a year later in 1993, tweaking the graphics and control scheme and tasking the player with liberating an island of the living dead from a witch's curse. But more substantial changes came with a spin-off title, 1994's The Romantic Blue, which took players back in time to the year 1712 and entrusted them with the duty of saving the town of Shadowcrest from the clutches of a dark sisterhood. This entry took the traditional point-and-click gameplay of the original trilogy and combined it with light RPG elements like combat, looting, magic, and a touch of dungeon crawling. The Last Half of Darkness series remained dormant for several years after this release, returning in the year 2000 with a remake of the first episode bearing the same name. The new Last Half of Darkness was a more casual and puzzle-oriented title, and was available as both an online browser game or a mail-order CD-ROM release. This in turn led to a reboot of the series in 2005 with Last Half of Darkness: Shadows of the Servants, which expanded upon the remake's focus on puzzles and minigames, but further streamlined the controls and featured much improved production values. Shadows then received 2 sequels. Beyond the Spirit's Eye was released in 2007, using the same gameplay mechanics as Shadows but with even higher quality audio-visual assets, whilst 2009 saw the release of Tomb of Zolgyr, again following the same formula but on a larger scale. The final game to be released in the series is 2011's Last Half of Darkness: Society of the Serpent Moon, a third-person adventure that kept most of the features of the previous 3 games, whilst expanding on storytelling and NPC interaction. Though over its 20-year history the Last Half of Darkness series changed somewhat in terms of gameplay mechanics, background lore, and production values, every game in the series stayed true to the spirit of fiendish puzzles, non-linear exploration, and most importantly, blood-curdling horror. But despite the original Last Half of Darkness receiving some recognition as a cult shareware title, today, even to those who've played the original episodes, the series exists as little more than hazy memories, a puzzle from one game, a gruesome death scene from another. Though a new wave of fans emerged with the series' reboot in the mid-2000s, this was limited to the point-and-click adventure enthusiast scene, and with the final game in the series now almost a decade old, the franchise is again slipping back into obscurity. In today's video, we'll take a look at the history behind the series, how each game looks and plays, and what this Last Half of Darkness universe actually is. Feel free to continue watching for the full story behind these games, or you can pause the video now and check the chapter timestamps to find exactly what you're interested in. So with that out of the way, let's get started by learning about who's behind Last Half of Darkness, and where it all began. Despite the name, WRF Studios are really just a single person. that being one William R. Fisher III, who goes by Bill Fisher in the adventure games community. Like many of his generation, Fisher grew up in the age of the text adventure, when companies like Infocom were experimenting with the exciting new medium of interactive storytelling. Personal computers were no longer just for business reports and word processing, but for transporting players to worlds hitherto the realm of movies or literature, where they were not merely passive observers but active participants in these stories. Yet as technology improved, text adventures began to rely less on prose, or rather the images it conjured in the player's imagination, and more on visual storytelling. Games like 1984's King's Quest blazed a trail for the graphic adventure genre, letting players actually see the environments being described to them and watch their actions play out before their very eyes. But these more realistic and immersive experiences also created a demand for more direct forms of interaction than text input. Fortunately, at the same time as these digital realms were coming into sharper and more vivid focus, a company called Apple Incorporated introduced a new personal computer called the Macintosh, which was controlled with a mouse and graphical user interface. Thanks to early adopters like ICOM Simulation's MacVenture series, graphic adventures followed suit, and the point-and-click genre, which combined detailed graphics with a mouse-driven control system, soon came to supplant text games. The genre quickly encompassed a wide variety of experiences, from science fiction epics to spy thrillers and raunchy sex comedies. But it was 1986's Uninvited that captured Bill Fisher's attention. This chilling and challenging tale of a haunted hell house combined interactive fiction with puzzle solving, non-linear exploration, and nail-biting audio-visual features that guaranteed new players would be on the edge of their seats.
I got you!
Fisher was inspired by Uninvited, and his love of horror stories in general, to develop his own point-and-click adventure, leading to the release of Last Half of Darkness in 1989. The premise and gameplay mechanics were very close to those of Uninvited, with the player exploring a haunted manor house in the hopes of saving a damsel in distress, solving puzzles and surviving the many murderous entities that threaten to bring an abrupt end to their adventures. But though in many ways a direct homage to Uninvited, LHOD differed in two crucial areas. First, it was developed by a single amateur programmer rather than a whole team, and second, it was not backed by an established publisher. To actually sell Last Half of Darkness as a commercial product, Fisher, operating as Soft Lab Laboratories, therefore had to try and advertise the game himself and find shareware outlets willing to carry the title. The original shareware game was marketed as but the first in a series of terrifying adventures, with future episodes offered via mail order. Although Fisher was selling Last Half of Darkness by itself for a few dollars, shareware merchants would usually bundle it as part of software compilations, often including LHOD alongside titles like Hugo's House of Horror, another indie horror adventure that was sometimes confused for Fisher's game. This meant that Last Half of Darkness flew under the radar of mainstream reviewers, mostly relegated to the pages of specialist magazines or early BBS communities of dedicated adventure game enthusiasts. Still, some of those who stumbled across the game considered it something of a hidden gem, and its reputation began to grow. It wasn't until the early 90s that Last Half of Darkness started gaining real traction, with some mail-order outlets making the centerpiece of advertisements for their shareware offerings. By this point, it wasn't only the English-speaking world that had taken notice of the game, as several European vendors, in Germany, Italy, and even Eastern Europe, were offering LHOD as well. In 1992, it gained a further boost when it was bundled with issue 9 of Enchanted Realms, a bi-monthly journal dedicated to adventure games. This version of the game was not quite the same as the original release, though. Due to both fragmentation in the PC market and the pace at which technology was developing, Fisher created several distinct versions of Last Half of Darkness, some sharing the same title, which differed not only in graphics and sound, but also in gameplay, layout, and overall length. And by the time the first episode was featured in Enchanted Realms, it was already being marketed alongside its sequel. For a $20 registration fee, graphic adventure fans would be mailed a copy of Last Half of Darkness Part 2, which rejoined the protagonist of the first game as they evaded vampires, zombies, and hungry hellhounds in their search for a missing companion. Enchanted Realms contributor Chuck Miller reviewed both episodes in the May 1992 edition of the journal, saying that though the series' presentation left much to be desired, desired, its modest graphics and distorted sound effects were nevertheless suitably atmospheric, adding that its puzzles were the real attraction. It wasn't long after that Fisher brought the Last Half of Darkness trilogy to its conclusion, with Last Half of Darkness Part 3, which was both far less punishing than the first two episodes and a noticeable step up in visual fidelity. This time the action took place across the length of a whole island, replete with Cursed Town, a haunted manor, and even a Lich's castle. When Chuck Miller returned to shine a spotlight on the series in January 1993, the Last Half of Darkness series had moved up in the world, as Miller reviewed the 3 episodes not in Enchanted Realms, but in the prestigious Computer Gaming World magazine. The review was mostly positive, as Miller again opined that though the series couldn't compete with bigger names in the genre, such as the Elvira games, it was still a solid and enjoyable horror adventure. But as an aside, Miller also had to explain how to deal with the series' increasingly elaborate copy protection features. Though the Last Half of Darkness games were a popular choice for inclusion in shareware bundles, they were perhaps even more popular in wares compilations, especially as CD-ROMs became more widespread and it became possible to fit hundreds of cracked titles on a single disc. A common anti-piracy measure was requiring a unique password, which could only be found in the game's manual or by emailing the developer. Another was the use of hint books, which could be obtained via mail order and might reveal cheat codes, the location of secret rooms, or perhaps alternative routes through the story. And some titles, especially adventure games, were particularly inventive, using code words or puzzles. Fisher himself was inspired by the technique employed by Infocom and its successors, which used so-called feelies, physical items that could be used as promo toys, collector's items, and of course as a novel form of copy protection. Fisher employed all these methods in the 4th and final entry of the original Last Half of Darkness series, Gothic horror love story The Romantic Blue. Released in 1994, Romantic Blue featured not only regular password-based copy protection and the $10 hint book incentive, but also came packaged with a stylized spiderweb puzzle that was key to in-game progress. Of course, anti-piracy measures weren't the only innovations, as Fisher also continued to streamline the interface and mouse controls, thus providing a more immersive view space and reducing keyboard use, and increased the level of interaction between the player and NPCs. But a bigger change was the introduction of a dungeon crawling element to the series. Although the last 2 LHOD titles had featured mazes, Romantic Blue went further and added a simple combat system and loot that could be used to upgrade the player's sword or purchase spells for use in the Shadowcrest crypts. Whilst the rest of the game adhered closely to the standard point-and-click format, these new mechanics were likely a symptom of Fisher having grown tired of the standard graphic adventure formula. Fisher has stated that by this point he had become bored of working on point-and-click adventures for so long, and he certainly wasn't the only one to lose interest in the genre. The mid to late 90s saw the crumbling and almost complete disintegration of the adventure game market, perhaps best represented by the meteoric rise and equally speedy decline of the Myst series and its copycats. Many cherished graphic adventure developers, from LucasArts to Sierra Online, were forced to shut down or try, unsuccessfully, to revive the market with innovations like 3D graphics or action-adventure elements. Fisher himself had in fact briefly flirted with action-adventures in 1991's The 9 Lives of Secret Agent Cat, which combined the LHOD engine with spy gadgets, firearms, and multiple controllable characters, and 3 years later his interest in alternatives to the adventure genre had only grown. The Romantic Blue would thus be the final commercial release from WRF Studios for some time, as Fisher began working on several other shareware games and proof-of-concept demos, beginning with the 2D platformer Death by Dark Shadows, an early and unsuccessful foray into 2D platforming that shared some aesthetic and thematic similarities to Last Half of Darkness. Fisher certainly wasn't timid about trying something new, and spent the next few years dabbling in all kinds of different genres, working on titles like the Diablo-esque Ghost Blood, the theme park-inspired Funhouse of Terror, and flight simulator-cum-horror Servants of the Red Sky. Thus, it wasn't until the year 2000 that the Last Half of Darkness series made its return, this time as an online in-browser experience that featured static backgrounds and gameplay somewhat similar to Myst and other puzzle-driven first-person point-and-click titles. The Last Half of Darkness remake was partly used as a marketing tool to attract players to some of Fisher's other games, such as the multiplayer vampire adventure Shadowhunter, the minigame-oriented Haunted Casino, or the online action RPG Bloodlust. Fisher also offered an enhanced CD-ROM version of Last Half of Darkness via mail order, which he continued to work on over the course of the next few years. By the end of 2004, this version of the engine had evolved enough that Fisher used it as the basis for a reboot of the series, starting with 2005's Last Half of Darkness: Shadows of the Servants. Shadows further streamlined the control system and introduced pre-rendered 3D cinematics for cutscenes and scene transitions, as well as continuing the tradition of Feely-based copy protection. By then, there had been a minor resurgence in the indie adventure market, particularly for lower-budget first-person games, such as 2002's Darkfall. And though few mainstream gaming publications paid much attention, the return of the Last Half of Darkness series caused a small stir in the online adventure game community. Writing for AdventureGamers.com, Laura MacDonald gave Shadows 3 stars out of 5 for its atmosphere, accessibility, and mildly challenging puzzles. MacDonald did remove points for the game's occasionally frustrating non-linear exploration and sometimes dated pre-rendered 3D graphics, but also called the story enjoyably camp, remarking that, overall, life is good for fans of horror schlock. Mezzo Magic's Gordon Applin also liked the reboot, giving it 4 stars out of 5 and saying it was genuinely creepy and menacing, albeit in a less subtle manner than Darkfall. Applin's only criticisms were of the distortion effects applied to the in-game dialogue, which he said made it difficult to understand some of the characters, and of its somewhat unsatisfying story. But Applin hand-waved these problems by saying that, in the end, Shadows of the Servants reminded him of the good old days of adventure gaming. A second game in the reboot series, entitled William R. Fisher's Beyond the Spirit's Eye, or sometimes simply Last Half of Darkness 2, followed in 2007 and used the same mechanics as Shadows. Mezzo Magic's Steve Ramsey reviewed the second title, and again awarded the series 4 out of 5 stars, saying that gameplay-wise, Beyond was densely packed with puzzles, reasonably generous with clues, and laudably open-ended. Ramsey admitted that in production values the game was quite clearly a one-man show, but that even so it pulled off the puzzles, atmosphere, and general scares with considerable panache. However, Adventure Classic Gaming's Eric Andreevich Mammon was less forgiving, granting Beyond 2 stars out of 5, and saying that though it was a passable throwback to classic point-and-click games, its story was lacking, the general layout and scene transitions disorienting, and neither the visuals nor audio design particularly scary. Vic Mammon argued that Beyond was certainly an impressive feat for a solo developer, but that it had difficulty meeting the standards of contemporaries, and felt like a game released a decade too late. Bill Fisher returned to the previous naming scheme with his next title, 2009's Tomb of Zolgyr: Last Half of Darkness, which continued in the spirit of the previous games. The reboot series had been comfortably coasting along for long enough that the brand was starting to regain some of its earlier notability, and Fisher partnered with publisher Iceberg Interactive for the game's European release. This time, Melanie Greeley penned the review for Adventure Gamers, granting Zolgyr 3.5 stars for its chilling and eerie atmosphere, extensive but accessible puzzles, and the always welcome physical feelies. Greeley was less impressed by Zolgyr's storytelling and voice acting, saying too much of the story was relegated to the extras, and that once again the audio distortion effects made spoken dialogue sometimes harsh on the ears or difficult to understand. Greeley also disliked some of the side characters and plot points carried over from the previous games, but felt that on the whole, Fisher had once again pulled off a solid, if slightly dated feeling point-and-click adventure. Adventure Classic Gaming also returned to the series, this time with Jenny Roos reviewing, and were far more positive than they had been to the previous title. Roos praised Fisher for maintaining a consistently spooky and unnerving experience that persisted throughout the entire game, arguing that Zolgyr achieved a nearly flawless balance of story, exploration, and puzzles. Though critical of the overuse of jump scares, one-dimensional or inconsistent characters, and sometimes incongruous animations, Roos gave Zolgyr 4 stars out of 5, and said that though it might not leave a deep or long-lasting impression, it was certainly a success overall. But despite these positive reviews, Fisher was again starting to lose interest in making point-and-click adventure games. He had been working on the reboot series for roughly as long as he had the original DOS games, and his attention was once more starting to wander. Fisher had already been experimenting with action RPGs and vampire stories whilst working on Last Half of Darkness, including the isometric Diablo clone Lost City of Vampires, and was already in the early stages of production on a fully 3D action RPG. All the same, Fisher still had a few ideas for adventure games he was interested in pursuing, and 2 years after the release of Zolgyr came Last Half of Darkness: Society of the Serpent Moon. Society was still at heart a non-linear point-and-click adventure game, but it broke with the Reboot trilogy in several respects. Most obvious were the shift from the Myst-style first-person perspective to a fixed third-person camera, the introduction of a distinct, fully voiced protagonist, and an overall stronger focus on NPC interaction and cinematic storytelling. Reactions to both the game itself and these changes in particular were somewhat varied. Adventure Classic Gaming gave Society 5 stars out of 5, the highest score of the entire series, with Mervyn Graham arguing that although Fisher had taken a big risk in shaking up the established formula, it had definitely paid off. Graham had no major complaints at all, stating that Society was at once both thrilling and absorbing, challenging but not unfair, and that it was overall a highly polished title, ending the review by saying he recommended it to any fan of adventure horror. But Astrid Buelink of Adventure Gamers had a very different experience. Buelink felt that the move from first-person to third-person adventuring made Society a less immersive experience, attributing this in part to the game's protagonist, and complained that the series was still too reliant on cheap jump scares. The review also criticised the graphics as technically unimpressive, the dialogue as occasionally difficult to understand, and the hint system as somewhat unhelpful. Buelink was particularly negative towards the Raven's Hunt minigame, which she considered out of place and too heavily influenced by random chance. All the same, she praised Society's accessibility, interface, and atmosphere, giving it 3 stars out of 5 and saying that it was a generally satisfying adventure. The adventure site Game Boomers also reviewed Society, giving it a B grade and taking a position roughly between that of Graham and Buelink. Reviewer Flotsam agreed that the move to third person had been detrimental to the franchise, that the voice acting was of mixed quality, and that the Raven's Hunt minigame was sometimes frustrating. Flotsam also noted the existence of several bugs that both he and third parties had run into. But he added that the gameplay remained solid, the story and characters engaging, and the difficulty reasonably balanced. Flotsam signed off by remarking that for longtime fans of Last Half of Darkness, Society of the Serpent Moon was a worthy sequel, and for newcomers, it was a great introduction to the series. But as it turned out, Society was to be the capstone to both the Reboot series and the Last Half of Darkness franchise in its entirety. By 2012, Fisher had been making graphic adventure games on and off for almost 20 years, and wanted to move on to something different. WRF Studios revived the Bloodlust franchise with 2015's Unreal Engine 3-powered action RPG Shadowhunter, and released a sequel, Nemesis, in 2020, this time on Unreal Engine 4. Fisher has confirmed to both myself and third parties that, though proud of the Last Half of Darkness series, he has no plans to return to the franchise, nor to traditional point-and-click adventure games in general, and as of this video, his current focus is the sci-fi dungeon crawler Earth's Shadow, which is currently available as an early access title on Steam. It may well be that Society of the Serpent Moon really was the closing chapter of Last Half of Darkness, a franchise that has witnessed both the dawning and, arguably, the dusking of the point-and-click graphic adventure. The story of Last Half of Darkness is therefore in some ways the story of the point-and-click genre as a whole, each game marked by Bill Fisher's unique signature, but also reflecting trends in gameplay, presentation, and storytelling that were happening in the wider market. So let's travel back in time to 1989 and begin our journey through this cult horror series. The original Last Half of Darkness begins with the player standing outside a very sinister-looking mansion, with their first objective being to explore the property and discover what secrets have been left behind by its late owner. The game uses what's often called a verb-based command interface, which means selecting a command, such as open, speak, or operate, and applying that to an object or character in the game world. It's effectively the same system used in OnInvited, minus the multiple container windows and with some added restrictions on item usage. And again, just like OnInvited, the world is divided into various individual screens, with movement accomplished by selecting the Go command and clicking a transition point within that scene. The player cannot of course phase through solid objects, so you may have to actually open doors or windows before being allowed to use them as transition points. There are also many objects in the game world that can be interacted with. A cupboard door might be opened to reveal a key, and the take command applied to grab said key and store it in your inventory. That key can then be combined with the operate command and applied to, say, a locked door. But progress will require a little more than finding keys and unlocking doors, as this is no ordinary house. The whole property is under the effects of a curse, and after a bit of bumbling about, the player is given a new objective, to figure out how to mix a magical elixir, rescue a young woman, and escape. The formula and ingredients for this concoction are concealed by hidden compartments or guarded by monsters, so the player has to search every nook and cranny of the house and its exterior to find the items needed, which might themselves not be immediately accessible. The solutions to these puzzles can become quite convoluted, requiring multiple items from all over the game world that might need to be combined with each other in the inventory before use. There's also the near-constant threat of the monsters, some of them guarding transition points, others triggered by performing certain actions, and one going out of their way to hunt you down later in the game. Whilst some of these will warn you before attacking, others will kill you the instant they appear, so even cautious and thoughtful players should make frequent use of the game's save slots. The length of this episode depends very much on how long it takes the player to figure things out. They could, hypothetically, spend their whole evening wandering around the property because they missed a single item or misunderstood a clue, or they might be both smart and lucky enough to finish the whole thing in half an hour. A speedrunner, knowing the solutions in advance, could likely finish within a few minutes. The second episode is almost identical to the first in terms of basic mechanics, utilising the same verb-based command system, screen-to-screen traversal, and potentially instant death enemies, but introduces many new puzzle types. This time the protagonist finds themselves stuck in a labyrinth in the bowels of the property, minus their lovely companion. This maze is in itself already a challenge, but exploration is further complicated by a darkness mechanic and a bloodthirsty hellhound that stalks you through the dimly lit corridors. The player needs to light a torch to navigate several areas of the labyrinth, but if caught by the hellhound, they'll have to use the torch to drive it off. This plunges the screen into darkness, and they'll need to feel around for the exits until they find another area with a lit torch. The labyrinth is also complicated by side rooms that can be used as shortcuts or to evade the hellhound. Though a map can be found, in the spirit of old school gaming, this can't actually be viewed in-game and needs to be physically printed out. There are also many stationary monsters blocking progress in certain rooms, some of whom will pose riddles to the player, others only neutralised via a special item. Speaking of riddles, the second episode also makes greater use of text input than the first, as you'll need to enter specific numbers, phrases, or passwords under certain circumstances. Even if the player reaches the end of the maze, they'll have to figure out how to open the exit, which involves more riddles and passcodes, not to mention a game of cards against the Grim Reaper. The final part of episode 2 involves paying a ferryman to take the player to Ghost Island, itself populated by more deadly foes, which must then be scoured from coast to coast for a means of escape for both yourself and the young lady. The third episode, which is sometimes confusingly labelled Last Half of Darkness Part 2, features a familiar goal but makes a number of small but noticeable changes to the interface and interaction options. The player finds themselves on an island of ghoulish townsfolk, cursed to on life by a dead witch, and is tasked with helping finish a ritual that can banish the witch's spirit. As with the previous episodes, this means exploring the whole island to find the ingredients for the ritual, like a magic potion, a bone, a lich's unholy blessing, and so on. Naturally, these are all hidden, guarded, trapped, or magically sealed away, so the player needs to get cracking filling their pockets with clues and puzzle items. It's in the interface and controls that the biggest changes are found. The hit and close options of previous episodes have been dropped, and remaining verb commands are now represented by a symbol, a magnifying glass for examine, a compass for go, a bag for take, a mouth for speak, a hand for operate, and a box for open. The inventory is now scrollable rather than appearing all at once, and speaking to an NPC now brings up a list of preset options rather than a text input, though the game does still accept the latter in certain situations, such as for the copy protection passwords. Although there are a few new mechanics, like an arcade shooter you can beat for an important clue, the puzzles and general gameplay are similar to the last two games. You'll once again have to traverse a maze, for example, and you'll have to answer riddles or use items to get past monsters. One difference with the monsters is that the player now has a life bar, so though there are still situations in which failure results in instant death, hostile creatures will now knock chunks out of your health rather than killing you instantly. The fourth and final game in the DOS series, the Romantic Blue, is the most unique of the four games. Set in the town of Shadowcrest, in this title the player is attempting to unite two star-crossed lovers, the only complication being that one of these lovers is part of a cult of witches that rule the town. Much of the Romantic Blue sticks to the point-and-click gameplay formula, but in a rather different form to the original trilogy. The UI is now of a very minimalist style. There are buttons to exit the game, display the save menu, open the inventory, or cycle through the different interaction options. These interactive options have again been streamlined a bit, and are limited to inspect, operate, take, or go. In scenes where NPCs are present, a query button is added, which triggers a greeting from the NPC, and then lets the player input a word that NPC will hopefully comprehend. Knowing what topics the NPC is familiar with can be gleaned from key words highlighted in their greeting, and inputting one of these will trigger a different response, which might then contain other key words. The NPC will not reveal all the topics they're familiar with, however, so at some point the player will have to return and try different keywords they picked up from clues or speaking to other NPCs. The game's puzzles are of a pretty similar nature to those of previous entries, exploring all the different locations, nosing through containers, combining items, and so forth. But at some point the player will need to descend into the Shadowcrest crypts, which is where the other part of the game comes in. The crypts are a labyrinthian area populated by undead guardians, who will ambush the player and start slashing and stabbing away. Initially, the player has no defense against them and will have to retreat until they find some loot. Loot can then be taken to the town blacksmith and used to purchase a sword. Upon returning to the crypts, the player can now attack and defeat the undead guardians and continue exploring. Unfortunately, that's only the start of the player's troubles, as not only is the maze almost completely devoid of unique landmarks, several routes are blocked by sealed barriers. Barriers can only be opened from the front by a key, but keys are a finite resource, and whilst barriers can be opened from behind without a key, upon passing through them they will lock again. The player can avoid these barriers for now and focus on fighting their way to the secret entrance to the Witch's Convent, where they can pick up a key item and interrogate one of the lovers, then return to the town and try to progress in some of the puzzles. Eventually the player will need to return to the crypts and start using keys, as key items are located in some of the farthest reaches of the maze. The farther the player gets, the tougher the monsters and the more convoluted the maze, and due to the limited number of keys, it's possible for the player to get permanently stuck in the maze. This is where the loot system comes back into play, as the blacksmith sells more powerful swords and the witch sells single-use spells that can instantly kill an enemy or teleport the player out of the maze. But loot itself is also finite, and there may be situations in which an NPC asks for payment in exchange for a clue. One other challenge comes in the form of a strange diagram scrawled on the floor of a defiled chapel, which is linked to the spider puzzle that was bundled with physical copies of the game. Assuming the player is reasonably cautious with their saves and doesn't get themselves into an unwinnable situation, they'll eventually discover the secret of the cult's dark powers, gather components for a ritual, and then descend back into the labyrinth one last time to enter the heart of the evil sisterhood and destroy them. It's no surprise that with a gap of almost half a decade, when Last Half of Darkness returned in the year 2000, it looked and played a little differently to the original episode on which it was based. The new Last Half of Darkness, whether the browser-based or CD-ROM version, tasked players with roughly the same objective as the 1989 game: explore a haunted manor, solving puzzles to access key items and enter new areas, and eventually defeat the dark power holding the property in thrall. And the game remains a point-and-click adventure, emphasising puzzle solving, key items, and clues. Still, though the interface and control system took elements from all 4 of the DOS games, Fisher continued to trim things down. Interaction options were limited to move, examine, take, operate, or open the inventory. Operate opens doors or containers, for example, or selects an item in the inventory for use on a point of interest or another item. Text input was dropped entirely, as was any form of distinct NPC interaction, though the now standard labyrinth returned. The fearsome pixelated monsters of the DOS series are also mostly absent, with 1 or 2 serving more as static obstacles than threats to the player's well-being. Last Half of Darkness 2000, as it's unofficially dubbed, is thus in some ways more missed than uninvited, a static puzzle game with a veneer of horror on top of the core gameplay. In length, the remake is certainly bigger and longer than the original episode, but it all depends on the player's luck with the puzzles, and finishing the game could just as easily take 10 minutes or 2 hours. Overall, the remake is roughly in line with the spirit of individual entries from the original trilogy, minus the violence, a mildly challenging but also fairly short experience that's closer to an episodic title than a full-price game. But when Last Half of Darkness was formally rebooted in 2005, Fisher made some adjustments. Though he continued to pare away at the interface and controls, from this point onwards Fisher would go back to expanding on rather than removing features from the series. In Shadows of the Servants, the player's objective is almost exactly the same as both the original game and the remake, in that they have to investigate a haunted house and the surrounding area, recover a number of unique items, and perform a ritual. The verb commands are now gone entirely, replaced with a so-called smart cursor that automatically changes to reflect the most logical action. Hovering over some items will display an examine symbol, others change the cursor to red to represent something that can be interacted with, and a compass appears for scene transition points. The interact command covers several options, including operating something, picking up an item, or speaking to an NPC, with the latter then opening up a handful of set dialogue options. Shadows does feature text input, though it's limited to a couple of very specific situations. The inventory remains, albeit hidden until the player moves the cursor over it. Once you open up the inventory, the items can be used with something in the environment, combined with another item in the inventory, or inspected more closely. Despite this further streamlining of the control scheme, Shadows of the Servants actually features much more variety in puzzles and unique mechanics than the original series. For example, the player finds a letter with a riddle on it, but the paper has been torn to shreds, so it'll have to be reassembled to form the original message. In another situation, an electronic device has been misconfigured, so the player has to consult a chart, one of the feelies in the original release of the game, and set the correct values to fix it. Another device has been damaged, so the player needs to jerry-rig it to restore the flow of current. There are also distinct mini-games scattered about, like the Tetris-esque Bloodstones, and though the maze returns, the version in Shadows is almost a separate mode, with its own control scheme, obstacles, and hostile entities, a sort of halfway point between the basic exploration of the original trilogy and the dungeon crawling of Romantic Blue. There are plenty of other unique interactable objects too, from computer screens to locked safes. Beyond all this, the basic puzzles in Shadows follow a similar formula to the original games. An object applied to another object, though simplified by the fact that hovering an item over something it can be used on will cause it to vibrate. Again, the length of the experience depends on wits and luck, but most players would probably agree Shadows of the Servants is closer to the experience of a full-price adventure than any of the earlier episodes. The reboot series continues the adventure with Beyond the Spirit's Eye, in which the player travels to the town of Shadowcrest, somewhat changed from its 18th century incarnation, and is again rummaging through its darkest recesses in search of ritual components. Core gameplay is unchanged from Shadows of the Servants. Beyond is once more a first-person puzzle-based adventure, but in a larger game world with even more challenges to overcome. The interface and controls are virtually identical to Shadows, but for this second entry in the reboot series, Fisher added even more unique puzzles and minigames. Win clues from the spirit world in a game of Hangman, break a pirate's cryptogram, unlock puzzle boxes, solve the Tower of Hanoi, and much more. Some basic puzzle types do return from Shadows, jigsaws, colour or alphabet matching and such, but there's new material to work with as well. More conventional point-and-click puzzles are again all about gathering clues and combining objects with key items or points of interest in the environment, sometimes with multiple stages. NPCs return too, again mostly as a source of clues. Aside from scale and complexity, the main difference from Shadows of the Servants is that the game world in Beyond the Spirit's Eye includes a whole town, rather than being structured around the centerpiece of the haunted mansion. So navigation in Shadows is aided through a map item, which lets the player teleport to different locations. In a sense, Beyond the Spirit's Eye could be dubbed Reboot Episode 2, since it is so similar to Shadows of the Servants. But in terms of new puzzles and the amount of content to get through, it's fair to call it a whole new game. And there's no doubt the same could be said of the third title, Tomb of Zolgyr, which sticks with the protagonist of Beyond as they arrive at the Isle of the Dead, rumoured to be the origin of the same dark curse that triggered the events of the earlier games. The player's goal is a little less straightforward in Zolgyr, evolving alongside the events of the narrative, but loosely speaking involves similar endeavours to the previous games. Explore the island, gather key items, and make your way to the Heart of Darkness for a showdown. All the basic mechanics are also the same. The smart cursor, the point-and-click environmental puzzles, the simple NPC interaction, and the mini-games, the latter again a mix of the old and the new. Structurally, the game is roughly akin to Beyond the Spirit's Eye in that it's fairly decentralised, though it differs from Beyond in that whilst both titles involve mostly non-linear exploration, Zolgyr is more aggressive in gating areas behind story progression. The game starts in what is essentially a tutorial cave, then opens up to give the player access to a large mansion and some exteriors, with plenty of mandatory back and forth between these scenes. Where it deviates from the last two games is that after solving the key puzzles on the main island, Zolgyr narrows its focus and funnels players through several smaller, self-contained locations until they reach the climax. But at the end of the day, almost anything that could be said of Shadows of the Servants or Beyond the Spirit's Eye can also be said of Tomb of Zolgyr. Still the same core experience, but with plenty of new places to go, people to see, and puzzles to solve. Of course, it seems like another rule of three came into play after Zolgyr's release. As with the original MS-DOS series, 3 very similar episodes would be followed up with a more ambitious 4th entry. So just as the last Half of Darkness trilogy was succeeded by the Romantic Blue, the Reboot trilogy gave way to Society of the Serpent Moon. Serpent Moon is loosely connected to the events of the earlier games, but focuses on the streetwise Billy Black as he investigates the disappearance of his girlfriend Wendy. Wendy was last seen investigating missing girls in the dingy and dangerous Antibes, and it's not long before Billy himself is butting heads with the criminals and cultists who run the town. Serpent Moon uses a fixed third-person camera rather than the first-person perspective used by all the previous games, and the player is now directing the protagonist to physically walk to different points of interest within a scene. There are also some additions made for the sake of convenience. The smart cursor is still here, but the game offers greater clarity as to what points of interest are most important to your progress. Anything that changes the cursor to a green icon is non-critical, so you can inspect it, but it's almost certainly irrelevant to the puzzles or story. If the cursor changes to red, then it is worth your notice, either as someone you can speak to, a scene transition point, or something that can be interacted with. You're also less likely to miss any side areas in your exploration, as holding down the tab key highlights all the area transitions, and getting around these areas is quicker than ever with a simple double click of the mouse. Aside from these changes, the fundamentals are mostly what long-time fans are used to, and the environmental puzzles are nothing too out of the ordinary either. Some puzzles do pop up more than once. One recurring element is the Raven's Hunt minigame, a mechanical board game in which the player has to maneuver their raven pieces to kill off the opponent's snakes. Another challenge that can crop up a few times is the serpent venom. There are certain points at which the protagonist is poisoned, clouding their mind and preventing them from attempting more complicated puzzles until they find a special potion. In terms of other modifications, there is a noticeably greater emphasis on NPC interaction, but as in prior games, this still involves a series of preset queries rather than text input or alternative dialogue options. In pacing and world design, Serpent Moon goes slightly further than Tomb of Zolgyr in restricting the player's freedom to explore. Although Zolgyr had already started down this path, Serpent Moon endeavours to tie exploration even more closely to story progression, so there are quite a lot of locations you can't access until meeting certain NPCs or triggering cutscenes. But as with the Romantic Blue, these changes don't make Society of the Serpent Moon any less of a Last Half of Darkness game. No matter the platform or the year of release, every single title in the series is about exploration, item hunting, puzzle solving, and, here and there, the odd scare or two. A lot of proverbial ink has been spilled regarding why point-and-click adventure games never seemed to regain the prominence they had back in the 80s and 90s. Were the puzzles too abstract? Did production costs outstrip the genre's inbuilt audience? Did the audience get dumber? Or were adventure games just too dull to compete in a market that was increasingly the realm of shooters and action-adventures? You'll find a lot of theories floating about, and surveying all the games in the Last Half of Darkness series is a bit like looking through a window into history, observing how point-and-click games evolved over time, and why they developed in these ways. Going game by game, you can definitely find evidence to justify many of the common complaints people had about the genre. And by genre, I do mean almost the whole damn thing. Between 1989 and 2011, Bill Fisher made enough point-and-click adventures to cover nearly all the most recognisable forms of the point-and-click adventure game, whether it was from the days of ICOM, Cyan Worlds, or even the early efforts of Microids and their contemporaries. In fact, the only era Bill Fisher didn't reach is that of the late 2000s and Telltale's early adventures, as they transitioned into the interactive drama. But before we get into what people were grumbling about in the 90s and beyond, it's worth pointing out that even way back in 1989, Last Half of Darkness, indeed any point-and-click graphic adventure, was to a certain faction of adventure fans already the antichrist of interactive fiction. You see, not everyone was happy to see the text adventure evolve into utilising the beastly point-and-click interface. Prior to this, some had complained of text adventures using any graphics at all. By doing so, they were no longer literature aimed at adults, but storybooks for drooling toddlers. Combining this with the point-and-click system was arguably a more significant shift, though. As Ron Gilbert mused in a 2020 blog post, early point-and-click games represented a trend towards streamlining interaction in favour of what he called use-verb gameplay. That is to say, there was a small pool of possible actions, a finite number of inventory items, and a scene with several points of interest. This reduced interaction to first poking and prodding any points of interest in the scene, and when that failed, using everything in the inventory with everything else they could see. Gilbert wasn't the first to make this observation, and others have argued that this system was the beginning of an inevitable slide into intellect-free interaction, in the sense that simply clicking on all the verbs and nouns in the interface is hardly engaging one's higher brain functions. It was only a matter of time before the point-and-click adventure devolved into the interactive movie, as the argument goes. Thus, by the standards of some, even if we start with the DOS era of the Last Half of Darkness series, we're already on the slippery slope towards automatism. You walk into a room, use the operate, open or take command on everything you can see, and head to the next room. Of course, macro narratives like the so-called point and drool argument, though useful for analysing the trajectory of graphic adventures, always obscure the finer details. I mean, initially, when the average player first walks into a room, they're still going to be making a judgment call as to which points of interest in a scene are likely to be relevant, as applying the verb commands to every single thing they see would be quite tedious and time-consuming. You're also going to take into account whether a point of interest is relevant based on some basic logic. If the player finds a hammer in one room, for example, they're more likely to keep an eye out for something worth hammering, and a running tap is probably of greater interest to a player carrying a container or who's seen something in need of watering. Still, eventually a player is going to start running out of things to use that hammer on. At some point, they're going to get tired of running around looking for houseplants. Maybe they can't find a key for a particular door, or they just don't understand the rules of a puzzle. And this, of course, is where we run into the usual complaints about point-and-click adventures, because eventually the player will get stuck, they will throw logic out the window, and they will start pixel hunting. Now, my experience with the early Last Half of Darkness games was that they're actually not that egregious in terms of difficulty. I was running around in circles a few times, but I've had worse experiences with better known graphic adventures. It's most likely to be the maze in episode 2 that catches people out in my opinion, since it has the torch and the hellhound mechanic on top of the challenge of the labyrinth itself. But once you get past that, I don't recall anything too frustrating. I wouldn't call it smooth sailing, but in the context of the genre as a whole, they're not appallingly hard puzzles. The only thing that really aggravated me in episode 3 was the arcade minigame, but thankfully that only gives out a clue for another puzzle and isn't mandatory. In my experience, it was actually the final, and in fact my favourite of the DOS titles, Romantic Blue, that was the worst offender. I got stuck for an hour because I missed a tiny vial sitting next to another bunch of very similar junk that the game had previously told me was worthless. And this is another common problem with adventure game puzzles: how the game teaches you to behave. Now, in the Romantic Blue, there's one instance where pixel hunting makes sense, as it's an area you would not normally bother clicking on, and would almost certainly miss under normal circumstances. But one of the game's later clues suggests you should investigate this spot further. In that case, it's fine you miss it the first time, because if it was easy or obvious, then there would be no reason for the aforementioned clue. But in another case, similar to the vial I mentioned before, the game is teaching you a perverse lesson. There are several screens in the Romantic Blue packed with crates, and clicking these consistently gives you the same message about them being useless or impossible to open, so you learn not to just randomly click on everything. That's fair enough. But then one of these boxes does happen to be open and does contain an important item, a list of spells you can purchase from the town witch, so that re-incentivizes the player just brainlessly clicking on every object they can see. In all fairness, the Last Half of Darkness series is by no means the only game of its type to be guilty of this, simultaneously teaching the player not to waste time verbing everything in a room, but also punishing them for not doing so. Also, the DOS-era entries feature a gameplay mechanic that's not found in every point-and-click title of the era, that being you can die. Theoretically, this should be further discouragement to the chronic point-and-clicker, in that simply clicking everything you see or mashing together objects without thought will get you killed. In the first game, for example, you come across a rather unfriendly looking individual who blocks your path, and makes it clear you should go back the way you came. Pressing the matter with him, by say using the hit command, will earn you a grisly fate. Likewise, in the third episode you need to separate a dog from their new chew toy, but using the knife on the dog results in an instant fail state, since you shouldn't just be running around knifing every obstacle in your path. The threat of a game over at least encourages the player to make use of some grey matter when approaching puzzles. But again, as with many other point-and-click adventures, there are plenty of issues with this. In the first game in particular, there are numerous instant death scenarios no reasonable person, as far as I'm aware, could possibly have predicted, such as opening a drawer and being killed by a giant cobra. This wasn't necessarily all that onerous a setback, since the game is so short, and to some extent these sudden deaths were themselves something of a selling point, but we'll come back to that later in the video. The second episode of Last Half of Darkness is a bit fairer about insta-kills, but it's also possible to maneuver yourself into an equally unpleasant end, being soft-locked by misusing items or failing at a minigame, preventing completion of the game. The third episode tried to cushion the threat of oblivion with a health bar that gave players a second chance to remedy their mistakes, but it still has one or two instant death scenarios, and though I didn't encounter the problem myself, from what I've read it's very easy to misuse key items and make the game unwinnable. The soft locking issue remains in the Romantic Blue, as getting stuck in the crypts and having to reload a save or restart the entire game from scratch is an ever-present danger. This sort of thing, not necessarily instant death, but locking yourself out of finishing the game without immediately realising it, was another oft maligned feature associated with a certain adventure game developer that I shan't name. On top of this, the Romantic Blue also plays host to a personal pet peeve of mine, getting the bad ending because you didn't take a very specific sequence of actions at the start of the game. This isn't quite the same thing as a game-ending dead end, but even so, unless the game is built around multiple playthroughs, I'm not a fan of that sort of thing. I suppose you could counter that Romantic Blue's version is less a case of good versus bad ending and more the regular ending versus a secret bonus ending. I wouldn't have even known about the second ending were it not for an LP by a channel called Letande, who apparently found out about it directly from Bill Fisher. I'd speculate that this good ending was revealed in the $10 hint book, as was, again this is just an assumption, the route in the first game that let you barge in on a young lady having a nice bath. I've never seen the original hint books though, so I could be completely wrong. So let's give Fisher the benefit of the doubt and consider Romantic Blue from another angle, the not-so point-and-click side of this point-and-click adventure. Looking back at graphic adventures from well into the 21st century, it's easy to think of the genre in terms of only those games that are most famous today. When you think of 90s point-and-click, what comes to mind for most people is the Monkey Island series, Full Throttle, Indiana Jones, Broken Sword, and a few other franchises. Whilst there are notable differences between all these titles, in terms of controls and general mechanics, from the perspective of an outsider, they all seem like the same kind of game, just with different themes. But there were a lot of more experimental titles that combined point-and-click adventure gameplay with strategy, role-playing, or action gameplay, and the Romantic Blue did something similar with the dungeon crawling. Delving into the Shadowcrest crypts isn't necessarily indispensable to the overall experience. It could be cut out and the game reconstructed as a purely point-and-click deal, but it's not something tacked on at the last minute either. Fisher has said that there was nothing specific that inspired him to build the Romantic Blue around the crypts. He was just experimenting with things that he found interesting at the time. It's possible the dungeon crawling was the natural evolution of the series' curious obsession with mazes. Mazes were one of the few things from Uninvited that Fisher didn't tip his hat to in the original Last Half of Darkness, so maybe his insistence on putting a labyrinth in every single title in the series for the next few years was some kind of apology to ICOM. I think it would have been interesting if Fisher had gone a bit further with the Shadowcrest crypts. Instead of making the undead and lock and key system a hard counter to the player, where messing up means reloading from outside or restarting the whole game, maybe he could have made dying in the crypts a mechanic in itself, not ending the game but respawning some gold, keys and enemies without undoing the player's progress. But that would all be decoration on top of the basic dungeon crawling system Fisher had already successfully implemented. In the end, he did what he set out to do, and had apparently decided against progressing any further in his crossbreeding of point-and-click and RPG gameplay. As it stands in the final game, though the dungeon crawling is an interesting twist, it doesn't really affect the other side of the game, the point-and-click gameplay. The only notable difference between Romantic Blue and the earlier episodes, beside the streamlining, is the text input for NPC interactions. This isn't uncharted territory for point-and-click games, but it's arguably an improvement over the original trilogy, where NPCs had either almost nothing to say at all outside of an extremely limited pool of puzzle-specific phrases, or the player just clicked through a bunch of preset queries. There is what I'd hesitantly call actual gameplay in the Romantic Blue's NPC interaction. You have to not only watch for what keywords are used by the NPCs themselves, but also try to remember what new topics you've learned since talking to them last. But the downsides to this system are the same as in other graphic adventures. Aside from probably being a pain in the neck for dyslexics, text input is often a case of 10 fails to every 1 success. The total pool of keywords recognised by an NPC is still far too small from the player's perspective. I suppose to fans of older text adventures it might have been a pleasant throwback, but since you're only typing individual words rather than feeding whole sentences into a text parser, it probably didn't feel as rewarding. So as the curtain fell on the DOS era of the Last Half of Darkness series, it was in a state not unusual for games of its type. The point-and-click mechanics, environmental puzzles, and general challenge were all pretty standard for the genre, and probably attracted or repulsed audiences for exactly the same reasons as its better funded and more famous rivals. So when the series was refashioned and subsequently rebooted in the 2000s, to what extent did the changes Fisher made impact the gameplay? Well, we can actually look a bit further back than the Romantic Blue to get a taste of that. I mentioned that Fisher made multiple versions of the original Last Half of Darkness. The differences between these different versions were mostly in graphics and sound options, though there were some other minor changes in the layout of the mansion or in-game text. But the black sheep of these various incarnations appears to be the 1991 release of Last Half of Darkness, sometimes dubbed the VGA or True VGA version by retro sites. In this version, the interface and verb commands have already been streamlined, the mansion's exterior areas cut out, several of the puzzles removed or simplified, and most notably, the player can no longer be killed. When I asked Fisher about it, he said he couldn't recall much about the 1991 version, let alone what the motivation behind these changes was, and at the time of release it must have seemed like a bit of an anomaly. Based on the in-game text, I think it was probably a proof-of-concept trial version made to advertise improvements in the later episodes. But whether it was by coincidence or by design, this safer and more accessible version of Last Half of Darkness was a prelude to what happened to the series when it was relaunched in Y2K, with the browser game and its upgraded CD-ROM release. Last Half of Darkness 2000 mostly formalised and consolidated the streamlining process that had begun with the third episode, so general environmental interaction doesn't feel all that different from the Romantic Blue, though the addition of text to highlight exactly where the move command will lead does make life easier, and reduces some of the frustration of missing area transitions. I say some of the frustration because it's still possible to spend hours in-game and miss a room because you didn't notice the exit point, though that's something we'll come back to in another part of the video. With the dungeon crawling and NPC interaction of Romantic Blue gone, Last Half of Darkness 2000 does feel more like a pure adventure game than the 1994 title, at least by the standards of the time. The line between that and just being plain shallow is a thin one, though. Certain things that return from the original trilogy, like the maze, have less to them than their original incarnations. It's not that the remake is a cakewalk or anything like that, you still have to put some thought into puzzles like the spiders and the clock, for example, but the game can't hide the fact that its origins lie in an online browser game, and even the CD-ROM version feels limited by that. It's the kind of static background adventure that you used to find as part of edutainment software, where you go on a tour of a museum or some heritage site, with the puzzles and mechanics designed for simplicity and accessibility. It's undoubtedly a more casual-friendly game than the original episodes, though when I say casual, I don't mean it in a pejorative sense. It's more to emphasise the idea that Last Half of Darkness 2000 feels like where the series pivoted more towards people who don't typically play computer games, or at least computer games outside of point-and-click adventures. This was the great offence that Myst was accused of inflicting upon the genre back in the 90s, that it opened the gates to the great unwashed masses, the non-gamer crowd. A common sentiment expressed both at the time and in retrospect is that Myst was a game designed for and appealing to people who hate games. It was a digital slideshow, an art game, a game for people who like to experience games rather than beat them. There was far more to criticism of Myst's legacy than that, obviously, and many of these criticisms were mutually exclusive, coming from opposing corners of the figurative boxing ring. But there's definitely a distinct break in continuity between the old guard of point-and-click adventures, of which the Last Half of Darkness DOS series was certainly a part, and the Myst era. Last Half of Darkness 2000, and the 3 games preceding it, are undoubtedly part of that latter grouping. I should point out that when I talked to him, Fisher denied the remake being influenced by any one title, saying he was again just experimenting with different approaches. But regardless of where the idea came from, whether it was Myst or the FMV adventure wave of the 90s, the similarities are self-evident, and from the 2000s onwards, the series began moving away from ICOM's MacVenture series and towards the Myst experience. In the context of Last Half of Darkness 2000, this can seem like a step backwards, with features streamlined or removed entirely, and nothing to replace them, not in novelty value and certainly not in depth. The innovations of a Romantic Blue have been removed, NPCs are effectively non-existent, the puzzles are no more sophisticated, and it's lacking even the threat of death present in the DOS-era games. In a gameplay sense, how important injury, death, or more broadly permanent fail states were to the series is debatable, but they did exist, and they were still an element of how you interacted with the game world, and how it responded. I've seen many sources argue that the original Uninvited, and by extension the early Haunted House style of adventure games that existed prior to Alone in the Dark, are all examples of a sort of proto-survival horror. The applicability of this label I think varies from case to case, and it would be quite a stretch to try and categorise the original Last Half of Darkness episodes as part of this. All the same, survival is an undeniable element of the gameplay, when the player is being actively hunted in the first 2 episodes, for example, or when exploring the crypts in the Romantic Blue, and it's something that was left behind when the series resurfaced in the 2000s. So looking at the progression of the Last Half of Darkness series, the Y2K remake does come out looking rather the worse for wear, the moment the series transitioned into a less intensive, less challenging, and all in all less sophisticated type of game. To those who espouse the point and drool hypothesis, it represents the natural progression of the point-and-click genre as it sloughs off the dead skin of critical thinking and metamorphosizes into a toddler's game. As a product, it feels perilously close to a bargain bin title, an asset flip slideshow made by some random shovelware developer that, had it been released a decade later, would undoubtedly have been a mobile game. But the 3 titles that followed the remake, Shadows of the Servants, Beyond the Spirit's Eye, and Tomb of Zolgyr, showed that the Myst formula, if that applies here, didn't necessarily represent degradation. You could certainly argue that the Myst audience, specifically that faction of graphic adventure fans who only really play graphic adventures, are a distinct demographic that tend to shy away from skill-based or stat-intensive genres like action games or traditional CRPGs. But that's not to say the Myst model is unintellectual. Though accessibility and streamlined methods of interaction are favoured, this type of game is also characterised by its affinity for more traditional puzzles. Mechanical toys, mathematical puzzles, cryptograms, colour matching, word games, and many other forms of intellectual stimulation that are common outside of computer games. These are the domain of Myst likes, and indeed of the rebooted Last Half of Darkness series. From 2000 and beyond, the series retained the environmental puzzles and riddles of the original DOS games, but appended to these many unique mini-games that were difficult to represent within the confines of the old engine. True, it was now totally divorced from the kind of experience that might be classed as survival horror, but objectively speaking, the post-2000 games are by no means less sophisticated than the original series. In none of the DOS entries can the player open their inventory, inspect a random item, and suddenly find themselves playing with a combination lock. Nor does the original series have impromptu jigsaws, or electronic board games, or anything like the rich variety of puzzles present in the newer games. So whilst the limited survival elements of the original trilogy, and the rudimentary combat of Romantic Blue are gone forever, this loss was dwarfed by the amount of puzzle-oriented content that replaced them. This doesn't guarantee everyone will prefer the reboot games to the DOS era, of course, since quite a few of these new puzzles are the type that some players will find boring or perhaps more tedious to solve than those of the older titles. The reboot games are usually described as being of an intermediate level of difficulty by graphic adventure standards, which is probably about right, but some of them are arguably more intimidating than others. In the 90s episodes, virtually all the puzzles at their worst could be solved by spending enough time wandering around looking for further clues, or brute forcing them with ungodly application of the verb commands and item combinations. Some of those in the reboot games are more skill-based, in the sense that you need to do them right or you're never going to pass, regardless of whether you have access to a guide or not. Personally, I seem to have a peculiar weakness against timed matching puzzles, such as the one at the end of Tomb of Zolgyr, and I can imagine some of the minigames testing the patience of other kinds of players. There was also a symbol matching puzzle that I felt was the subject of a rather badly worded riddle, but maybe that was just me. The reboot series actually includes an auto-solve feature that completes certain minigames when the player opens them up, but doesn't touch the screen for an extended period of time, though which types of puzzles or minigames are affected by this seems to be somewhat inconsistent, and I doubt anyone would use this feature unless it was something they couldn't use a guide for. What hasn't really changed is the difficulty of the more traditional point-and-click environmental puzzles, as in picking up items, combining them with the matching point of interest, operating the correct objects in a scene, and all that. These aren't noticeably harder or easier than in the DOS games, and when the player gets stuck, it's the same old story all over again. Go room to room, double-checking for anything you missed, using everything in your inventory on everything else, and consulting any notes or riddles to see if they seem germane. The changes to the interface and control scheme will make this process a bit less frustrating than it was in the 90s, but that only feeds into accusations of graphic adventures being dumbed down, since features like the smart cursor encourage the player to simply sweep their pointer around every room and wait for the game to tell them what to do. Still, I think that just like with the DOS games, there's always a certain amount of thought involved. The player takes note of what he saw or acquired in one room and perceives the rest of the world in the context of that. And I think this system works best when it operates in harmony with the general layout and structure of the world. Of all the reboot titles, I personally thought the system worked best in the first one, Shadows of the Servants, since the whole game is centered upon a single, fairly interconnected location that's laid out in a way that should seem reasonably logical to the average player. The majority of the game world is taken up by the Manor House, which has its kitchen, library, study, greenhouse, dining room and such on the ground floor, the bedrooms and bathrooms above that, below the house a cellar and some secret rooms, and on the edges of the property a graveyard, storage shed and so on. In terms of both general navigation, key items and environmental puzzles, it's all perfectly intuitive from the player's perspective, and makes for a comfortable starting point from which everything can be designed around. There are a few slightly more random locations, like the swampy area access towards the back of the manor grounds, or the tiny snippet of New Orleans that sits outside the manor's front gate, but nothing too confusing. The other two games lose a little of this. Beyond the Spirit's Eye has a few locations that barely connect to the rest of the game world, and the town of Shadowcrest itself can be confusing to navigate, as it chooses to feature locations that have no logical connection outside of game logic and narrative demands. One important location is a bar, another a fishery, another a rather haphazardly designed mansion, then a cave complex, a gypsy house, and so forth. It lacks the coherence of Shadows of the Servants' manor grounds. Tomb of Zolgyr is much worse, as though near the start of the game it features a small manor in the vein of Shadows, the other locations are just random spots all over the island, like a cemetery, an abandoned cave that's used for the tutorial and nothing else, and a fisherman's hut. The rest of the game feels like it was designed as a river cruise, sometimes quite literally, as the player progresses from one small scene to the next, none of which are really interconnected beyond finishing everything in one area and using it in the next. At one point the player travels to a lost city, for example, which consists of one scene for the dock, a couple of alleyways, and a ramshackle block of flats, after which they hop into a sewer, go through a cave system, and end up in a hidden temple, likely never to return to previously visited locations. It's not like there isn't much to do in these individual areas, it's just that in gameplay terms they feel more like a series of challenge rooms, not a fully realised world. Typically, one of the reasons developers opt to structure a game in such a linear fashion is to give them more control over how the player experiences the story, but Tomb of Zolgyr doesn't feel that narrative driven in the first place, so it seems premature. It's more than likely that this was the point at which Fisher began considering how to design a more story-driven and dialogue-heavy graphic adventure, which found its partial expression in the final game of the series. In some ways, 2011's Society of the Serpent Moon feels like it yearns to be a story-driven adventure, with less emphasis on exploration and multi-scene puzzles, but it doesn't quite go that far, and remains firmly in the traditional point-and-click adventure camp, whether it likes it or not. Contrary to my expectations, the change to a third-person camera and heavier focus on NPC interaction belie what is a very familiar experience for anyone who played the previous 3 games. Serpent Society's puzzle design and minigames are done in almost exactly the same style as the Reboot trilogy, whether that be Valve puzzles, toy boxes, cryptograms, or general point-and-click verbing. Regarding the latter, I do think the game feels a little smaller and a tad less interactive due to the even more aggressive smart cursor, since you can now just sweep over a point of interest and know immediately whether it's worth clicking on, but that might have been a way to preempt player frustration over having to make Billy walk to everything. As far as new or semi-new mechanics go, there is an odd little addition not present in the older games. Whilst exploring the world, the player has to collect every single little green coin they can find, as they're used as currency for a couple of puzzles towards the end of the game. There's not much to this, you just notice the cursor changes colour in certain spots, so you go over and pick up a coin. It's a bit of an odd and frankly quite mindless sub-objective that I suspect was probably intended for some other purpose earlier in development. The other major piece of repeated content is the Raven's Hunt minigame, which, based on the reviews I read, was received poorly. One reviewer enjoyed learning the rules, but virtually all the other critics I read cited Raven's Hunt as a negative, usually complaining about either its randomness or its glitchiness. Both criticisms rang true for me. Essentially, each time the player is presented with a new board, they can reset it and retain their existing score, so long as they haven't moved any of their Raven pieces. But the difficulty level of each new board varies considerably. Sometimes the player is impossibly outnumbered by serpents, sometimes they have a significant advantage over the enemy. And on top of this, it's entirely possible for the player's ravens to miss multiple attacks in a row, which cripples their chances for the rest of that round. Considering that losing a single round resets your score, there's no reason not to be cautious and keep resetting the board until you see a setup that looks impossible to lose. As for bugginess, I saw several cases of the board resetting with no enemies and automatically winning me the round. Whether the inverse is possible I don't know, as well as the enemy automatically moving at the start of a round, or randomly choosing to move pieces that were nowhere near my ravens, wasting their turn. Speaking of bugs, I also encountered a couple of cases of the player character being able to enter fake area transitions, which caused them to get stuck in part of the adjacent screen. Again, something a couple of reviews complained about. Other than that, I didn't notice any problems, though. Another element, less a new feature and more something given greater emphasis, is the NPC interaction, though I found this less impactful than in the Romantic Blue. The first 3 Reboot games had already added NPCs, and though there are many more of them in Serpent Moon, with a greater pool of questions for each, the formula is the same. You just go down a list of possible queries and in most cases completely ignore them for the rest of the game. Romantic Blue at least had a little bit of interactivity with the text input and going back and forth between NPCs to test out new keywords. Serpent Moon NPCs are basically just barriers or info dumps. There was one point where I thought you might need to put some thought into the dialogue choices, as it seemed like I had the option of either paying an NPC with a green coin or saving that item by instead finding some food for him, but I later found out that he refuses the coin anyway, giving you a clue instead. So again, as with the old point and drool complaint, you might as well just click your way through things without much conscious thought. So, broadly speaking, I don't think Serpent Moon is substantially better or worse than the other Reboot games in gameplay terms. I'm just a little surprised the areas in which it differed had so limited an impact on the overall experience, as the small changes it made are neither major improvements nor mortal injuries to the basic formula the series is known for. It could be a positive or a negative, I suppose, since anyone who liked the first Last Half of Darkness in 1989 could conceivably enjoy the last entry in the series in 2011. All the series really lost in the intervening years was the fear of death, and all it gained was more puzzles and new minigames. What it gained would undoubtedly not be enough to sway the mind of the interactive fiction fanatic, who viewed the point-and-click adventure as a perverse Star of Bethlehem, guiding the genre into the degenerate era of the visual novel and the interactive drama. To someone of that opinion, the franchise's nigh-continual process of streamlining and structural linearity would only confirm their suspicions. But to more forgiving graphic adventure fans, the Last Half of Darkness franchise serves up almost 2 decades of, at worst, adequate gameplay in the traditional point-and-click style. That's quite an achievement for a lone wolf developer punching above his weight, and one can hardly fault Bill Fisher for failing to solve the graphic adventure dilemma when developers with 100 times the resources couldn't save the genre either. Still, Fisher wasn't only trying to make an adventure game, he was also trying to make a horror game, or at least a horror-themed game, and in that there's more than gameplay to consider. There's the art, the atmosphere, the oral anguish that drives players to madness, in theory at least. So, for the next part of the video, let's see how Fisher, with a little help from others, painted the horrid tableau of the Last Half of Darkness.
Wake up! Wake up! For the shadows come for the living.
Although the original Last Half of Darkness came out in 1989, its shareware status, lack of marketing, and just the general nature of the industry at the time meant that many players, and the only professional reviewers I could find, didn't become aware of it until the early 90s. You might also recall there were multiple versions released for different hardware. The first episode, indeed the second and third as well depending on how late the review, were therefore being viewed in the context of more famous graphic adventures from anywhere between 1990 to 1993, some report having first encountered Last Half of Darkness in 1996 thanks to a CD-ROM release. In some cases it's not even clear which specific version is being reviewed, or even how many there are in existence. Contemporary sources and the games themselves refer to a CGA, EGA and VGA version, though retro sites tend to categorise them into EGA, EGA+, and True VGA, a problem exacerbated by debate over the accuracy of these various labels. For the sake of simplicity, we'll use the most well-known and widely available version from 1990, officially labelled VGA whether it really is or not, which looks to be the one most commonly seen in old magazines and advertisements. Despite its limited colour palette, the original Last Half of Darkness is wonderfully moody, depicting a classic haunted house that is visually foreboding and yet not too fantastical. There's a nice balance between mundanity and stylised aesthetics, in that some rooms seem perfectly appropriate to a venerable old suburban home, others are full of medieval heraldry and flanked by antique suits of armour. It feels straight out of a haunted house movie from the 70s or 80s, without feeling like a theme park attraction. And to complete the effect, everything is draped in cobwebs and saturated in an ethereal blue, with Fisher holding brighter colours in reserve for special points of interest, like the warm orange glow of an open fireplace, the stark pink coat and straw blonde hair of the mysterious little girls, or the shocking red of sudden violence. In contrast to the earliest releases, this build of the game also added a crumbling stone interface being strangled by bright green overgrowth. Unfortunately, the audio is less worthy of mention, as most versions of Episode 1 are silent save for a couple of 5-second theme tunes and some short beeps for interaction. One of the final versions added support for the Covox speech thing, which brought digitized speech and sound effects to consumers, and one-man development teams. What contemporary reviews I could find disliked this, complaining that the audio was too distorted, though I did see some positive comments from recent years, from people who played it back in 1991 reminiscing about the novelty value of hearing real speech emanating from their speakers. Whoever was in the right, I don't think the effect has held up well, and I'd venture that it's more immersive to leave the sound off altogether. Still, even if sound design wasn't his forte, Fisher definitely had an eye for colour and composition. The ominous opening shot of the house, the crooked footpath that winds towards a pale blue moon, or the bronze-skinned damsel in repose upon a sacrificial slab, a yawning black portal poised to swallow her whole. It's a great example of establishing atmosphere with very limited resources, though as is so often the case, it wasn't really given credit for this by reviewers at the time, who were naturally more appreciative of newer technology and higher production values. Chuck Miller, as we saw earlier, compared it unfavourably to the Elvira games from 1990 and 1991, whose graphics were handled by something like 4 or 5 professional artists. It's hardly surprising that Fisher, who lacked the assets available to the Elvira team, had trouble matching the level of detail or animation quality that Horrorsoft could pull off. And again, don't forget that many people didn't encounter Last Half of Darkness until 92, 93, or even later than that, by which point even Fisher's muse, 1986's Uninvited, had received a full-colour facelift for Windows 3.1. The later, so-called true VGA release of Episode 1 is a lot more detailed than the original, with the interface bordered by rotting wooden frames and bloody text labels, and the in-game graphics, though still soaked in a dim blue light, feature more colours per screen and extra animations. It's not necessarily an improvement over the older versions though, as some might find the generally brighter and more vibrant palette less moody than the original. The abundance of swamp weed and moss invading the house now gives the impression of a property that was abandoned 100 years ago rather than having been recently occupied. And there doesn't appear to be a noticeable improvement in sound quality either, at least over the upgraded EGA releases, though I might have misconfigured the audio.
Leave this house now.
The second episode of Last Half of Darkness was somewhat less prodigious than the first, and to my knowledge only an EGA-VGA version was advertised by Fisher. Visually it's a bit more colourful than the original game, with the maze consisting of screens full of whites and greys and flaming torches, then a blood-red crypt, coconut trees and erupting volcanoes and so on. Blue is again the predominant colour in many scenes, but NPCs and monsters like wizards or zombies also stand out. It's not as richly detailed as the true VGA version of the first game, which I think may have been made later than Episode 2, but more importantly I think that what it gains in variety it loses in consistency. Whereas the environments of the first episode were both atmospheric and somewhat plausible, those in Episode 2 are a little too fantastical. You jump from attics to dungeons, from dungeons to ritual chambers, from ritual chambers to game rooms, from game rooms to tropical islands. It's almost more suited to King's Quest than horror. Fisher also made limited progress with audio design, as sound effects are again mostly absent aside from some beeping and some poor quality speech samples that are more hilarious than horrifying. Episode 3 of Last Half of Darkness represents a minor break with the visuals of the first 2 episodes. First, the interface has been redesigned. The grey stone and green plant life of the previous games has been replaced by solid blue, and the window containing the in-game action has been expanded to take up the majority of the screen. This obviously aids in immersion, though I think the colour scheme of the interface is a bit distracting. I would have preferred something more appropriate to the setting. Otherwise, Fisher has managed to temporarily repress his obsession with the colour blue, and the environments in Episode 3 make great use of the expanded colour palette. Although like Episode 2 there's quite a bit of variety to the different scenes, it doesn't feel as random and eccentric as your progression through that game. The town, mansion and undercellars feel like they slot together just as real places would. The only area that seems like it was clipped on as an afterthought is the Lich's castle, which looks imposing but is basically just an establishing shot, an entrance, and the throne room. But though I thought episode 3 looks alright, I also saw quite a few commentators on retro sites calling it uglier than the first game, or more specifically, that the graphics were too, quote, MS Paint. I'd say this is mostly a side effect of the viewport being much larger than previous episodes, and thus the simplicity of the graphics more obvious, though I'll admit there is something more to these criticisms. Many of the NPCs in episode 3 do look very simplistic, and the environments have a more gaudy and toy-like appearance to them. I think this is due to the first game's limited palette, in that many individual objects in the game world were given detail by subtle variations in colour and outlines, whereas in episode 3 some objects look like they were just assigned a single flat colour and left as they were. This is by no means a universal issue. There are plenty of environments that prove Fisher hasn't lost his touch, with shadowing and depth and an eye for every object's place in the overall scene, but I can see why people who've played all 3 games tend to remember the first game's visuals more fondly. And once again, the weakest aspect of the game's production values, even by the standards of the time, is its audio work. There's not much to enhance your sense of immersion in the world, just a couple of short jingles to pass as music and some digitised speech, though the latter is definitely much better quality than what was in episode 2. Out of everything in the original trilogy, it's the sound design that most consistently fails it. I would say it's what most obviously marks these games out as products of their time, but that's not entirely true, as there were plenty of DOS titles in 1991 that had good music or pretty effective use of sound despite the technical limitations. Fisher was probably just especially disadvantaged due to his limited resources and perhaps being slow to adapt to emerging technologies, particularly if he didn't want to lose the portion of the market still using older hardware. That in turn made it difficult for him to improve his skills in this area. But with 1994's The Romantic Blue, the last half of Darkness series got quite a boost in audio-visual fidelity. The title wasn't a purely figurative one. Almost every single screen in the game is suffocating under said colour. In many ways it feels like a return to the spirit of the first episode, with most of the environments painted in shades of black and blue, and other colours kept in reserve for the UI or important points of interest. An alleyway, for example, might be practically monochrome besides a flickering yellow fire, whilst intrusive spirits emit a sickly green light. It's a very stylised look, even more so than the first game, and does a fantastic job of making Shadowcrest feel both languid and malignant. It's as if the darkness that blanketed the town was slowly draining it of life, leaving only empty buildings and the unpleasant glow of an evil cerulean sun. That's my impression of it anyway. Not everyone who played Romantic Blue was as keen on its visual style. Some retro reviewers who played the game thought this gimmick rather tiring on the eyes or just rather dull to look at, and many, well I say many but there's not much of a pool to draw from when it comes to this game, were very harsh on the use of bloodied text in the interface. Whilst I'll defend Fisher's overall approach, I can't really defend the latter choice, as though I didn't have a problem reading any of the words, they may well be illegible to some players. Perhaps it didn't look so bad on a CRT screen or something. I'll also admit that on a technical level, the one-man army of Bill Fisher had trouble competing with the standards set by rival professional adventure studios. C-list or otherwise, there were some pretty stunning graphic adventures available by the mid-90s, with beautifully rich and detailed backgrounds, not to mention wonderfully animated NPCs and props. This extended to the sound design. Some titles included fully voiced NPCs, an extensive library of sound effects for every environment and action in the game world, and even a music score. Fisher had undoubtedly made progress since the original trilogy, as many NPCs do have a fair bit of voice acting, there's some environmental noise, and there are even 2 or 3 simple music tracks that loop during exploration or dungeon crawling.
The servants came like bats from the shadows to take our sister into the darkness.
But once again, being a solo developer also meant being well behind the curve in certain areas, and despite the improved production values, like having actual cover art this time round, at first glance, or first hearing, The Romantic Blue seems like a game from several years prior to its actual release date. The NPC close-ups highlight their lack of detail and simplistic colouring, the sound effects are still very sparse, and the voice acting is sometimes unintentionally funny or difficult to understand.
I must go, Jack.
Still, even though I'll concede that the Romantic Blue is undeniably limited by its budget, I also think it's the most visually distinct and evocative of the DOS-era last half of Darkness games. The sense of dread that clings to the edge of almost every scene, as if oblivion is rarely more than a few steps away, or the striking, painting-like quality of certain scenes, like the forlorn Miranda gripping the bars of her moonlit cage, her long hair writhing in the storm. Fisher always seems to have had a talent for powerful images, even if practical limitations kept him from synergizing this with the audio and animations. So it's interesting to see what happened when Fisher revived the series many years later, as though last half of Darkness 2000 retained the first-person perspective, there were a lot of changes in other areas. The hand-drawn 2D art was replaced by static backgrounds, which appear to be composites of various stock images with individual objects then overlaid on top of these, then the whole thing touched up to add shadows and lighting effects. Some animated 3D effects are used here and there, and I think the maze is constructed entirely from pre-rendered assets. There are even a handful of live-action clips that can play during general exploration or cutscenes. Overall, a very different approach to the DOS games, one that allowed for some extremely detailed and realistic environments. Of course, whether an objective improvement over the original series is a matter of taste. Firstly, whilst the 90s titles did have their fair share of hidden items and pixel hunting, the way scenes were composed tended to draw the player's eye to specific points of interest, and different items or furniture in the room were usually clearly delineated. Everything you could see in an individual scene was presumably placed or drawn there by hand, consciously put there for a specific purpose. But the readability of a scene suffers when it's using photorealistic images. It's not entirely clear in LHOD 2000 how much of a background is from the original photo and how much was put there by Fisher, but the fact is that these images just aren't as choreographed as the old handmade 2D backgrounds. Your attention isn't really drawn to specific places in the way it was the older games. There's too much visual clutter, and all of it blends together too organically, so your mind sort of discards a lot of details in the same way it would as if you were there in real life. Key items usually stand out, but it's much easier to overlook chests or drawers or other containers, or miss screen transitions because they weren't highlighted clearly enough. Of all the games in the series, the remake was the fastest to drive me to start randomly clicking everywhere on the screen in the hopes of getting lucky. It also hinders general navigation, as it seems like the locations in the remake are either photos from a bunch of completely unrelated places or just missing too many connecting rooms for them to feel coherent. Some scenes look like they're from various country estates, others from holiday homes, and others from a palace. It's not as absurd as the mishmash of locations in Episode 2, and I'm not pretending that the Romantic Blue wasn't occasionally confusing to navigate, but it was still something I noticed. Another change I took note of was in the audio. You'd assume that with a gap of around half a decade, last half of Darkness 2000 would be an enormous improvement over the Romantic Blue in this area.
It's easy to get lost in here.
On a technical level, this is sort of true. The CD-ROM version uses waveform audio, or WAV files, for its background tracks, sound effects, voice clips, and music. You have to remember though that the remake was actually a budget title and originally designed around web browsers, so it's hardly sporting Hollywood production values. As with the Romantic Blue, there are still going to be areas in which there's no sound at all. No music, no background noise, no dialogue. In fact, LHOD 2000 is probably a bit worse in this regard, as you're not even speaking to NPCs as frequently. A really big problem, something that Fisher always seems to have struggled with, is the actual quality of the recordings. There's significant distortion in some of the dialogue, making it occasionally injurious or incomprehensible, while some of the music and sound effects are marred by audio artifacts like crackles and pops. Long-time subscribers to my channel will know that I'm in no position to lecture anyone on sound quality, but all the same, Fisher really should have solved these problems by the early 2000s, when even amateurs didn't really have much of an excuse for such low-quality audio assets. I say early 2000s rather than a specific date because, as I mentioned earlier in the video, last half of Darkness was, informally speaking, released multiple times, in the sense that it was constantly being worked on by Fisher in the years after its original release. What this meant was that the initial online and CD-ROM versions of the game were slightly different to those played or purchased in, say, 2003. Over the years, Fisher seems to have slowly replaced many of the stock images and photorealistic assets of the first version with pre-rendered 3D backgrounds and animations. This represented a completely new direction for the series, and all subsequent games, from Shadows of the Servants in 2005 to Society of the Serpent Moon in 2011, would stay more or less faithful to the new standard. The first 3 Reboot games, Shadows, Spirit's Eye and Zolgyr, are especially close in art style, and you can make sweeping generalizations about the visuals that could easily apply to all of them at once. Shifting from photorealistic stock images to pre-rendered 3D backgrounds seems to have benefited the series in 2 ways. The first is that each scene is again constructed by hand, this time with 3D modelling software, rather than by stitching together whatever photos were available. Secondly, it meant Fisher was able to create pre-rendered 3D movie clips that moved almost seamlessly from regular gameplay to cutscenes and back again. The length and frequency of these increased with each new entry, and by Tomb of Zolgyr, these were often just used to smooth transitions from one adjacent scene to the next, further creating the illusion of a contiguous world rather than a series of static backgrounds. The overall effect of all this compared to Last Half of Darkness 2000 is that the environments are more intuitively laid out and more plausible as explorable locations, and individual scenes are once more designed in such a way as to subtly direct the player's attention to particular items or areas on the screen. Whilst I did occasionally miss things in scenes from the Reboot trilogy, I wasn't pixel hunting or getting lost nearly as much as in the 2000 remake or as in some parts of the DOS games. I think the most confusing place to navigate was probably Shadowcrest in the second game. This is partly due to the point I mentioned before about it not really being designed around a central location, but it's also because Fisher designed 1 or 2 extra backgrounds for the same scenes depending on which direction you entered them from. This is a cool effect, but actually makes it easier to lose your bearings when trying to navigate the town. Overall though, neither item hunting nor exploration are made more difficult by the move away from the visual style of earlier games. Using pre-rendered 3D also meant that, in the context of the wider industry, the series wasn't struggling quite so hard to keep up with its rivals. Adventure games were mostly low-budget affairs by the mid to late 2000s, and even those with larger budgets were often pressured to render NPCs, and in many cases entire environments, in real-time 3D, which posed its own set of problems. Although some reviewers did call Last Half of Darkness dated, by point-and-click adventure standards it was far more competitive with its rivals than the DOS episodes had been in the early 90s. Even Shadows of the Servants, now almost 20 years old, still holds up well, with environments that are highly detailed and feature a very moody interplay between light and shadow. The environments in the Reboot trilogy cover a fair variety of locations, from New Orleans by night to an old Louisiana fishing town, and finally the colonial estates and crumbling ruins of an exotic island chain. But graphically there aren't too many noticeable differences between the different titles. There's an escalating use of FMV and a gradual increase in the number of NPC models, but other than that the average player would probably have trouble telling the games apart. Technologically speaking, the only other thing I noticed was the increased use of animated props or extra effects on top of the pre-rendered backgrounds. These existed in Shadows, but are used more frequently in Spirit's Eye, and become a very common feature in Zolgyr's backgrounds. Some are integrated into the scene very well and enhance the atmosphere, as well as help lessen the feeling you're just clicking through a static slideshow. Unfortunately, Spirit's Eye is where Fisher starts utilising what I think are a mix of animated GIFs and real-time rendering to mimic environmental effects like rain or swaying foliage. These do not blend so well into the pre-rendered backgrounds, as they're affected by very distracting visual artifacts like aliasing. Fisher uses this technique even more aggressively in Zolgyr, and both games suffer for it, as it results in a few scenes actually looking far more dated than those in Shadows of the Servants. But some people will take issue with Fisher using any 3D in the first place. Pre-rendered 3D assets, especially in lower budget games, do sometimes end up looking very generic and samey in comparison to the amateur 2D art of the CGA to VGA eras. If there's anything in the Reboot series that seems obviously of its time, it's probably the NPC models, which definitely have that pre-rendered early 2000s cutscene look. I'm not sure if Fisher made these himself or they're from an asset store, and wasn't sure the politest way to ask him. I think it's the latter, as I'm pretty sure I recognise some of those faces from my personal collection of visual novels, but browsing the old LHOD website it seems like he made his own 3D models, so I'm not so sure. Still, they're not distractingly bad or anything like that. In my opinion, the pre-rendered 3D approach was the right one to take, as it seems like Fisher was able to not only create excellent looking environments, but also produce a good number of them, and slot in some spooky animations and FMVs. Of course, establishing tension in a horror game is as much about sound design as it is the visuals, and I think that from Shadows of the Servants onwards, Fisher finally nailed what had long been the series' biggest failing. For the first time, assuming we discount Romantic Blue, Last Half of Darkness had its own theme music, which Fisher retained for all subsequent entries. Sean Beeson is listed as the composer in the game's credits, though I'm not sure if that means he did all the music in the game or just the main theme, as he's credited in the following games alongside a Xavier, an Amatron, and an Arcana. I don't know if these are individual composers or some kind of music library service. Either way, all the Reboot games make very good use of the soundtrack, and when playing consistently maintain an atmosphere of, at best, brooding melancholia, and in some sequences imminent peril. I specify when playing because one reviewer, Melanie Greeley, criticised Fisher for restricting too much of the music to cutscenes. In Greeley's view, he should have woven more of it into general gameplay. I can appreciate this criticism, not only because it makes it harder to extract the music for use in this video, but also because I think the tracks are good enough to listen to by themselves, and there were one or two points where I thought the game was a bit lacking in auditory stimulation. These moments were rare, however, as another huge improvement that came with the Reboot trilogy was in using more ambient noise and sound effects. Regardless of the game, most scenes have something going on. A crackling fireplace, the drip drop of water from a leaky tap, the hiss of steam from a nearby pipe. More germane to a horror game, of course, is the anxious creaking of floorboards, the venomous whisper of angry spirits, the heavy footfalls of an on-scene stalker, or really any old classic to make sure the player feels thoroughly unwelcome. On top of this, most actions have proper audio feedback in the Reboot games, like rattling a doorknob, turning a wheel, cutting through a chain and such. This might all sound rather elementary, but the point is that most of these sound effects would have been missing in earlier games. Granted, it's obvious Fisher had stretched his budget. If, like me, you played all the games back to back, you'll notice that a lot of the ambient noise and individual sound effects are recycled. But it's hardly a negative, and by the standards of Myst-like graphic adventures, the quantity and quality of sound effects is more than acceptable. Or it is to me, at least, because, yet again, if you look at contemporary reviews, there were numerous complaints about the dialogue, specifically the distortion effects applied over the recordings.
You have won again. The life inside is what the fruit will hide.
The voice acting being incomprehensible isn't just detrimental to the story. In Shadows of the Servants, for example, the spirits will sometimes growl clues at the player, and without the aid of subtitles they'll miss these. I honestly didn't think this was a big problem even in Shadows, let alone Spirits or Zolgyr, which had slightly better audio, but then again I was coming into it from the older games, so perhaps my standards were very low. The acting itself, which was partly handled by professionals depending on the game, wasn't something reviewers seemed to have felt too strongly about either way. Laura MacDonald, for example, called it mixed, ranging from adequate to pretty good, which matches my impressions of it. At worst, it's phoned in or a little over-enthusiastic, which feeds into the carnival sideshow vibe, as MacDonald put it. That said, the gulf between amateur and professional work does become more stark in the final Last Half of Darkness game. As I mentioned before, even with the shift to third person and a voiced protagonist, Serpent Society wasn't a dramatic break with the first three Reboot titles, but it was clearly more oriented towards NPC interaction and storytelling. This had some ramifications for both the audio-visual presentation and the standards expected of more cinematic graphic adventures. As you'd expect of a 2011 game, the general quality of the graphics is slightly above that of the previous 3 titles, again utilising pre-rendered 3D backgrounds overlaid with animated props, but at a higher fidelity. I think that the scenes in the Serpent Society engine are no longer static backgrounds, but actual 3D environments with pre-rendered 3D to 2D art on top, but I'm not 100% sure of that. What's immediately obvious, of course, is that rather than observing these backgrounds from a first-person view, the player now controls the character of Billy Black, who exists within the game world as a mobile and independent entity. This isn't the case with every character in the game. Some are still just part of the background and mimicking the appearance of movement via what is essentially flipbook animation, but the protagonist himself is a 3D model being rendered in real time. That change by itself was controversial. Some reviewers said the last half of Darkness games were more immersive and unnerving to play in first person, as a silent protagonist. We'll come back to that point in the last part of the video, but in terms of visual presentation, there is something to be said of the immersion value of first person, peering down a corridor into the blackness beyond, or the crushing claustrophobia of winding tunnels and tiny cellars. Whilst I don't deny that even before anything else comes into play, there are inherent benefits to using a first-person perspective, I also feel the problem isn't just with the change in perspective, but the fact it was the first time Fisher had actually made a last half of Darkness game in third person. Anyone who likes survival horror games knows there's no shortage of techniques you can use to make fixed camera or third-person perspective just as scary as first-person. But that requires very careful manipulation of framing, angles, scene composition and such. If you look at the scenes in Serpent Society, it seems like most have been very consciously designed for the sake of convenience and readability. In other words, they're designed for a point-and-click adventure game, not a horror game. Oh, sure, thematically speaking they're horror scenes. Plenty of impenetrable shadows, flickering lights, dense fog, blood-stained floors and all that, but their principal purpose is to assist the player and reduce frustration. In some ways that's a good thing. We've gone over some of the common problems people complained about regarding pixel hunting, exploration and navigation in graphic adventures. But it also means the scenes are more instructive than they are scary, helping highlight points of interest and scene transitions for the player, but not contributing to their feeling of helplessness or sense of anxiety. It's not impossible to do both at the same time, but I suspect Fisher was still finding his feet with Serpent Society, and had he made the switch to third person in 2005 instead of 2011, I'm sure he would have done a better job balancing things out. The other, probably less serious issue is that whilst Shadows of the Serpent's pre-rendered 3D backgrounds have aged quite well, Serpent Society's real-time models weren't all that impressive even at the time. Aside from the fact his trench coat keeps clipping through his back, Billy's model seems like it belongs in Nocturne or some other early 2000s era action adventure. The backgrounds in Serpent Society don't have this problem, apart from the issue with certain animated props I mentioned earlier, and the FMV sequences look fine as well, though as with Shadows, Spirit's Eye and Zolgia, some reviewers were dismissive of the monsters, saying they just weren't scary. That's a fair point. I don't think skeleton monkeys, vague greyish-brown humanoids with red eyes, or zombie pygmies are the stuff nightmares are made of, but as far as I know, creature design was never considered the series' selling point. Where I think Fisher may have bitten off slightly more than he could chew is in the voice acting department. Fisher voices Billy himself, which is quite a substantial amount of work, and reviewers were not unanimous in their appreciation for his efforts.
My fiance's gone missing. Just tell me what I want to know, huh? You can go back to your nap.
Billy is a tough but world-weary and cynical character, which translates to a raspy, understated delivery. Adventure gamers Astrid Bulink described it as stoic but melancholy, which she felt was appropriate to the character and setting, and Flotsam of Game Boomers thought Fisher's work was by far the best of the entire cast. Conversely, Diane Hutchinson of Girl Gamers felt that Billy sounded unnatural, and Gaming Live's reviewer Tanya described Fisher's acting as wooden, with a grating pseudo-macho tone. The other characters also received mixed reviews, and Game Boomers complained that one was impossible to understand without subtitles.
Those coins that belong to you, they be the treasure, the servants.
Personally, I thought Billy sounded alright, but there were one or two occasions where his reactions didn't seem appropriate to the situation.
Oh man, what's going on around here?
More broadly, sound design is on roughly the same level as the Reboot trilogy, with a few small improvements. The music is usually limited to cutscenes, but most areas have ambient sounds in the background, and there's more direct audio feedback for Billy's actions than earlier games, plus the usual 3-second stingers and such. I noticed that the music this time is credited to an Alessa Maya, though again tracks are reused from earlier games, so I'm not sure who was responsible for what. And that covers the look and sound of the whole last half of Darkness series. It's interesting to see how Fisher's approach developed over the years, from classic 2D art to a brief flirtation with photorealism, and finally to pre-rendered 3D. I imagine the changes were as much about what technology was available as they were artistic choice. In the audio department, for example, Fisher was obviously trying to keep up with the times, but it's unquestionably the weakest element of the DOS-era games. Based on WRF Studios' more recent games, I wouldn't be surprised if a hypothetical future title were fully real-time 3D, although Fisher seemed to have valued backwards compatibility and support for lower-end systems. 2009's Tomb of Zolgyr, for example, was still compatible with Windows 98. This was probably a reflection of the kind of audience who like to play classic point-and-click adventures, who probably play on their old home PC or work laptop, and aren't too concerned with having the latest hardware. But for those who want to play the last half of Darkness series today, what are your options? Well, it's a tricky question, as making recommendations is as much about availability as it is compatibility. None of the original DOS games are available to purchase online, and WRF Studios no longer sell them by mail order. It's not especially hard to find physical copies of the original trilogy. Over the years, these are often included in shareware compilation CDs or bundled with gaming magazines to fill space. But it's a bit of a roulette in terms of which version you actually get. It might be the CGA versions, it might be one of the enhanced VGA promo episodes, who knows. With the first episode, you can usually tell which version you have with just a quick glance. The oldest versions have a very simplistic GUI with no stone borders. The latter releases look the same but with an enhanced interface, and the special VGA version, practically a different game, has a completely different layout with blue borders and red text. But even within these there are variations, such as EGA releases with enhanced sound options. Now, you won't be surprised to learn abandonware sites host pretty much all of these. However, the better known and more ethical abandonware sites don't host episodes 2 and 3, as Fisher contacts anyone hosting these and demands they pull them. This seems a bit strange to me. In my experience, developers couldn't care less if people are sharing 20 to 30-year-old DOS games that are no longer available to purchase. Indeed, I've spoken to some who explicitly encourage it. I asked Fisher about this by email, and he explained that the reason he does this is that some versions are extremely buggy, and over the years he's been bombarded with requests from people asking for tech support. The games themselves actually include mailing, email, and phone contacts for WRF Studios. And although Fisher didn't specifically state it, I noticed the same sites that pull episodes 2 and 3 don't pull episode 1, so I'm guessing Fisher isn't so bothered about the first and most stable episode floating about. Although I didn't push him about it, this doesn't sit right with me. He's not wrong to say episodes 2 and 3 are buggy. Computer Gaming World, for example, referred to episode 3 as a beta release, and all the copies I've gotten my hands on are indeed quite unstable. Thanks to that damn dog that seems to glitch out every scene he appears in, I only finished the game by guesswork, quitting to DOS and restarting, reloading, and blind luck. And obviously Fisher is entirely within his legal rights to go after what is, technically speaking, still software piracy. But I think it's a huge shame he'd contribute to memory holing his own games, since they're not available to purchase anywhere. When I was doing research for this video, I found countless comments from people who have vague memories of playing one of the DOS games as a youngster and trying to figure out what game or which episode a particular scene was from. Even some big-name retro channels like LG Reviews or Grimbeard have done videos or streams on at least one of the DOS episodes, but seem confused about particular details, mixing up one game for another, for example. Even after weeks checking old magazines, adverts, and retro sites, and emailing Fisher himself, even I have no idea how many different versions of the original trilogy there are. At the very least, it would be nice if Fisher bundled the old DOS games with one of his more recent releases, even if just as a promotional gimmick. The fourth DOS game, Romantic Blue, is even more obscure, and I've read comments on retro sites claiming that boxed physical copies, with all the old documents and feelies, have gone for $4,000 on eBay. The game itself doesn't seem to suffer from any serious bugs. The only issue I encountered was some ingredients for a key item being mislabeled. Again, you can find the game online if you look hard enough, but whether staining your immortal soul is worth it is down to you. So it's a shame Fisher doesn't put it up on GOG or something. Anyway, regardless of how you acquired them, all the DOS titles can be run easily enough via DOSBox emulation, though you might want to slow them down to prevent bugs with double clicking. Unfortunately, the 2000 CD-ROM remake of Last Half of Darkness is in an awkward place both availability-wise and in terms of compatibility. It's no longer sold by WRF Studios, and Fisher has said he's a bit embarrassed by it and doesn't want to put it back up on his site. Once again, you can try hunting down physical copies or look for it online, and you can even use Internet Wayback Machine to play the old online versions of the game, assuming you enjoy waiting 20 seconds between each click. In terms of compatibility, LHOD 2000 is a bit tricky to get running, as it was made for older versions of Windows, and making it work in Windows 7 onwards can be a bit of a pain. Personally, I was only able to get it running in an acceptable state by using a Windows 98 virtual machine and fiddling with the refresh rate, and even then it was running too fast to read some of the text. As usual, it would be nice to see it made legally available for the purposes of preservation, but probably would require a bit of work to get it operating on modern PCs. But don't worry, as all the games made from 2005 onwards are perfectly easy to find. Fisher originally offered these games individually on his website, with Tomb of Zolgyr published in Europe by Iceberg, and later made a trilogy pack containing the first 3 reboot games. Today, all you need to do is buy the final game, Society of the Serpent Moon, on Steam, and this will install the previous 3 games alongside it. These versions also have the anti-piracy features reworked or removed. The answers to these can now be found in either a notebook in your inventory or actually appear on screen during the minigames. Technically speaking, the games should run on anything from Windows 98 onwards, except for Serpent Society, which requires at least Windows XP. But there are some issues, at least on Windows 10. If you check the Steam forums, you'll find a lot of complaints about the first 3 games running either too slow or too fast, and I encountered the same problem. Now, they're not actually unplayable. Even at single-digit frame rates, I was able to do the puzzles and minigames. The easiest fix is to drop a DirectX wrapper into the game's main directory, which should fix the slowdown, and if you have a high refresh rate monitor like me, you'll also have to set a custom resolution at 60Hz to deal with the speed issue. Obviously, I can't guarantee these will work for you, but they worked for both me and most of the people with issues in the Steam forums. The fact that the games already have these issues on Windows 10 does make me a little concerned about the future though, since if they do break on a future OS, the only option is a virtual machine or retro PC build, which most people are not going to bother with. Hopefully Fisher will deal with this eventuality if it comes to it, as the reboot games are the only entries in the Last Half of Darkness series still widely available by legal means, so I personally think it's important they're not lost. But before we get all mulchy about artistic value and software preservation, we've still one more important topic to cover. The Last Half of Darkness series covered 20 years of haunted houses and horror tropes, an interactive love letter to B-movies and bloodthirsty monsters, and, like the gameplay, is almost a time capsule of horror movies old and new. It was also the chance for Fisher to create his own universe, full of witches and witch doctors, snakes and sacrificial cults, hidden treasures and horrible curses. So let's gaze into the past one more time, and finish up this video with a look at the story, setting, and characters of the Last Half of Darkness franchise.
Some people believe windows to the black world exist, allowing a gateway for the gypsies to summon the souls of the living into the world of the dead.
The story of Last Half of Darkness begins with the death of your Aunt Martha. She was a strange woman, a chemistry teacher by occupation, who lived in a large manor house, a venerable old place that had been in the family for generations, and hosted historical curiosities from across the globe. The house has a dark reputation. Some of your antecedents died violent and tragic deaths within its walls, and your aunt's past, it's been rumoured, was not so spotless either. There were whispers of strange alchemical experiments, secret gatherings, and in the recesses of your memory, flashes of bizarre and inexplicable phenomena. With your aunt's passing, the house lies empty and abandoned, and as her only living relative, you are now the beneficiary of her estate. Upon arriving at the property, you feel a sense of deep unease. The night is pitch black save for a pale blue moon leering out from behind the clouds. A chilling breeze passes through you and sets the gnarled branches of twisted trees to commence scraping against the house's weather-beaten exterior. You glance at the windows and start at the sight of a bright light. No one should be present other than yourself, and you resolve to investigate the house and uncover both the identity of the intruder and whatever secrets your aunt has left in her wake. It turns out that there is not one, but two intruders, a beautiful young woman and you. For the house no longer belongs to your family. It has become the property of a dark entity, a faceless and formless curse that has settled upon the estate and animates all manner of vileness. Within the house stir bloodthirsty spirits and hungry ghouls, and outside its walls lurk crazed killers and demons clad in flesh. Hidden behind a bookcase, you discover your aunt's laboratory, learning that she was as well versed in witchcraft as she was science. Just before her death, she was working on combining both disciplines in the form of a magic potion, a miraculous draught that could restore life to the recently deceased. It was a curiously timely experiment, for you hear a scream of terror and race upstairs to discover the still warm corpse of the young woman, brutally slain by some unknown assailant. To save her, you must find the ingredients for the magic potion, following instructions that your aunt had penned just prior to her own demise. The dark forces that have converged on the house will do everything in their power to stop you, and you'll need brains, brawn, and a little alchemical magic in order to best them. Overcoming some foes and fleeing others, you retrieve both the ingredients for the potion and a strange lockbox, but find the young lady's body gone. The corpse has been seized for some nefarious purpose, carried deeper into the property, into a hall of horror of impossible dimensions, an ancient sacrificial chamber that by the laws of man and science could not and should not exist here. You retrieve the young woman, and upon her awakening, your mysterious companion opens the lockbox to reveal a blood-red rose, a considerable sum of cash, and a strange letter from your aunt. Somehow knowing of both your arrival and the trials you have just endured, your aunt gives you her blessing to use the money and her property as you wish. But, she adds, should you wish to make use of either, you had better escape your current predicament first. Your way back from the sacrificial hall vanishes before your eyes, and the girl grabs your hand, dragging you further into the darkness. When you awake, you are back in the house, yet alone, and confined to a room on the upper floors that is unfamiliar to you. Your only route leads down into the cellars, down further into the dungeons. The halls are illuminated only by torchlight and an unnatural glow, and you find few friends in this place. Madmen jabber about secret names and stolen tomes. Walking corpses block your path. Vampires slumber in blood-red tombs, and at every turn you hear the baying of a great beast eager to take its revenge. Amidst all this terror, you chance across a waifish, wide-eyed little girl, though you wonder why she has been bricked up behind a wall and bound in heavy chains. The farther you get into the dungeon, the farther you stray from the world of life and logic, for all you encounter are more crazed spirits. You leave behind all sense of time and place, paying a Cositian ferryman to bring you across the cold waters to the Isle of the Dead. Upon this isle is a ghostly house of undead, a crew of rambunctious skeletal smugglers, and a living volcano that hungers for virgins. Overcoming these trials, you and your companion escape on a ship, but are sunk by cannon fire and barely make it to shore, heaving yourselves onto the rocks and losing consciousness beneath the shadow of a towering black fortress. You return to wakefulness no less disoriented than after your last impromptu nap. Somehow you have found civilization, or some vestige of it, albeit in the form of a town populated almost entirely by the undead. Nigh every soul in this place, be they gangster or policeman, tradesman or barkeep, all are cursed with the burden of on-life. It turns out that the source of this unhappiness is a witch, a cruel sorceress named Helda who once terrorized the town with black magic and mad experiments, torturing and twisting the locals for her amusement and edification. Helda was finally overthrown and burned at the stake in the town's centre, but her black soul endured the flames and laid one last curse upon her victims. Exploring the town further, you find a glimpse of a strange young woman who flees at your approach. Catching up to her, you learn her name is Telia, and that she is trying to undo the witch's curse with a magic potion of her own design. It seems Helda was but one of 3 witches, the Morrison sisters. One good, one bad, and one ugly, and only by investigating the history of these 3 sisters can you learn the secret of the concoction, and the location of the rare and powerful ingredients needed to brew it. The Morrison sisters once lived together in a great mountaintop estate, so you journey to the estate and begin exploring it in search of answers. The halls are eerily quiet, lit by everlasting torches or bathed in a romantic blue moonlight, and filled with silent spectres forbidden to voice their secrets. The estate will not easily give up the reagents needed to banish Helda's spirit, nor the other artifacts required to quicken the spell. Eventually you descend into the labyrinth beneath, where a gang of vampiric outcasts have fled, and Helda's failed experiments slither about in search of fresh meat. Having survived the town and its denizens, you help Telia craft the potion, and retrieve the last items needed to invoke the ritual. Though you finally break the curse, as Helda's spirit departs, she snarls that one day she will return, to haunt the world of the living once more. And the threat is by no means a hollow one. For more than 200 years prior, another black-hearted sorceress had herself cheated death, and lived on, in a fashion, to terrorize the inhabitants of a small Scandinavian town. The year is 1712, and you find yourself in Shadowcrest, a grim and gloomy place controlled by the priestesses of the Sisterhood. The Sisterhood began with a tale of tragedy and terror, with the gypsy sisters Morella and Dorina. The sisters were mystics of middling ability, moving from town to town in a caravan with others of their kind, where they sold alchemical potions or danced in plays with their fellow travellers. Whilst performing at one small village, Morella was seen by a young man, a knife thrower, who joined the caravan in the hopes of wooing her. The two fell in love and were engaged to be married, but the young man was murdered by thieves. Heartbroken, Morella sank into an incurable depression that became worse with each passing moment, and soon the young girl yearned for respite from her misery. Whilst travelling through the darker reaches of Europe, she came across an alchemist who brewed for her a blue elixir, telling her not to drink it until the pain of her sadness became too much to bear. When the caravan arrived at the town of Shadowcrest, Morella could take no more, and drank the elixir in the hopes of freeing herself from her heartache. The blue potion did indeed free Morella from her pain, and the next day she was buried in the cold earth of Shadowcrest. Her sister Dorina could not bring herself to leave, and when the caravan departed, she remained in Shadowcrest to watch over Morella's grave, eventually finding refuge at the local convent. Many years later, Dorina was on her way to pay her respects to her sister when she disturbed a grave robber who fled at her approach. Looking into Morella's grave, Dorina found that where her sister's heart should be, there was now a precious black stone. Curious, Dorina removed the strange object and returned to her convent, yet the robber had not forsaken his prize, and he followed Dorina, breaking into her room and attempting to steal Morella's petrified heart. Fumbling, the thief dropped the stone, which shattered into 3 pieces. 2 he fled with, but the third was left in Shadowcrest. The power of this black stone drew Morella back into the world that had so callously and cruelly treated her, twisting her spirit into a force that thirsted for vengeance and power. Morella warped the mind of her sister, teaching her black arts from beyond the grave, and soon the sisters had seized control of the convent, murdering those who resisted and turning the rest to witchcraft. The sisterhood spread its tendrils into Shadowcrest and beyond, growing their numbers by finding young girls and murdering their parents, then adopting the orphaned children into the cult. The Dark Sisters taught these girls the art of summoning, an unearthly talent that granted women the ability to draw people and spirits from afar and bind them to their service. The main purpose of the summoning was to control the dark creatures known as the Servants, demonic, shadow-like beasts somehow connected to the Black Stone, and used by the Sisterhood to enforce Morella's will. Though the Sisterhood's power and influence grew, they were careful to conceal their true nature, and for many years normal life continued in Shadowcrest, oblivious to the growing darkness and the corruption of the young girls being raised in the convent. Two such girls were Miranda and Cassandra. Cassandra, the older of the two, was inducted into the Sisterhood on her 17th birthday, and given a measure of independence, moving out of the convent and into the heart of Shadowcrest. She started to question the origins of the Sisterhood and their teachings, and began investigating the servants and the source of the Sisterhood's power. She also befriended the young Miranda, whose talent had already begun to bloom, faster even than the Dark Sisters had expected. Miranda was deeply unhappy with her life under the tyranny of the Sisterhood, stealing into the convent's library to read stories of fairy tale heroes and far-off lands, and she began to dream of places outside the dark walls of the convent, places of beauty and life. It stirred feelings in her she was not prepared for, no more than she was prepared for the arrival of a young pianist named Jack. Jack had come to Shadowcrest to study music, only to find that his teacher, Dr. Morrow, had already passed away. Moving into the Doctor's house, he spent his nights playing the Doctor's grand piano, and one night, the notes drifted upon the breeze and settled in the open courtyard of the convent. Miranda heard Jack's performance and was instantly smitten, using her powers to spy upon him as he played, and was gripped by a passion so strong that she unconsciously inserted herself into Jack's dreams. Miranda's obsession was swiftly discovered by the other sisters, and Morella was enraged, cursing Jack with a spell of sleepwalking that would last until Miranda's 17th birthday. Fearing for both her love and her immortal soul, Miranda turned first to Cassandra. Cassandra uncovered a secret that could overthrow Morella and free the other sisters, but before she could make use of it, she was murdered by the servants. With none left to aid her, Miranda turned inwards, focusing upon her nascent talent for summoning, hoping that some hero, like those in her storybooks, would storm the convent and rescue her. At first, her calls for aid were unfocused and misdirected. A young boy was drawn into the Shadowcrest crypts and immediately slain, and a succession of adventurers were being pulled towards the town, invariably killed by the servants and raised as undead puppets to guard against further intrusions. Soon, the day of Miranda's 17th birthday arrived, and the ritual that inducted her into the Sisterhood was performed. Miranda now knew that she was lost, that a black corruption was coursing through her blood, one that would likely consume her. Yet her love for Jack was as strong as ever, and she made one more attempt to summon aid. If not for her, then for Jack. That aid turns out to be you. Arriving in Shadowcrest with neither money nor weapons, you nevertheless have allies willing to help. Guided by Miranda's power, you seek aid from the local townsfolk, such as a blacksmith and an escaped lunatic, and are able to procure weapons to take the fight to the Sisterhood's undead thralls. Upon meeting Miranda in person, she begs you to take a letter to Jack, who remains ensnared in Morella's spell, and to investigate the house of Cassandra, who had hidden her research on the Sisterhood before she was murdered. Others are willing to risk their lives to see Morella's power broken. An antique dealer, a renegade sister, a witch, and a fortune teller, and with their aid, you discover the means to send Morella back to the darkness. But it seems that wherever darkness can be found, there will always be sisters and sorceresses and summonings and servile shadow creatures involved, for a similar story plays out hundreds of years later, in an abandoned estate on the edge of the New Orleans swampland. The home belonged to the esteemed Dr. Moretta Johnson, an accomplished explorer and academic, and her two daughters. Whilst on one of her expeditions to the South American rainforest, the Doctor encountered a spider monkey named Jaja. Growing fond of his friendly and curious nature, she decided to adopt him, and took him along with her to investigate the ruins of a lost temple. Whilst exploring the temple, Jaja suffered a nasty bite from some unknown creature, but seemed to recover quickly, and at the end of the expedition, Jaja accompanied Dr. Johnson back to New Orleans. Soon after returning home, however, Jaja's temperament changed dramatically. He became vicious and spiteful, spitting and clawing at the Doctor and eventually attacking her as she slept. Afraid for her life, Moretta had the crazed monkey put down, but in the days thereafter she was haunted by a ghostly screeching and visions of Jaja perched atop her bed. Believing the creature cursed, she burned his bones in the hopes of destroying him for good, but this only seemed to enrage Jaja's spirit. As the beast's baleful influence spread throughout the estate, Moretta became obsessed with black magic and genetics, believing that the only way to rid the estate of Jaja was to create a clone of his body and then purge him in a forbidden blood ritual. She spent years conducting unproven and dangerous experiments on laboratory subjects, producing countless twisted and freakish abominations in her quest to create a perfect clone of Jaja. These creatures lived and died in great fear and pain, and their spirits became vengeful shadows that joined Jaja in terrorizing the estate. As the curse worsened, Moretta delved deeper into the secrets of voodoo and spellcraft, using her vast wealth to have the temple she had discovered in the rainforest transported to the swamps outside her estate, believing it held the key to completing the spell of banishment. This was the environment in which the Doctor's 2 young daughters were raised, and they too were increasingly accosted by the dark spirits, the servants, as the Doctor called them, falling to madness and corruption. One daughter, Mira, developed a talent for witchcraft and summoning, a talent she would soon have great need of, for the power of the servants had become so great they were able to slay Mira's mother. With Moretta gone, in body at least, there seemed little defence against the servants. Everything that was tried, be it to satiate, soothe, or injure the dark spirits, only served to anger them. Thus, like Miranda before her, Mira turned to the art of summoning, performing a ritual to entice strangers to the estate and lift the curse. One after another, these strangers would come to Dr. Moretta's estate and attempt to banish Jaja and the servants, only to fail and further empower the darkness. By the time you arrive in New Orleans, the power of the darkness has become almost impossible to endure, having seeped into the foundation of the estate and spread beyond, into the swamplands and the town itself. You brave the estate of Dr. Moretta and steel yourself against the fury of the servants, consulting the ranting and whispers of Moretta and her daughters, the dark spirits, and a cynical witch living on the edge of the swamp. The answers you receive will lead you through windows into what your predecessors called the Black World, a dimension beyond the mortal plane where spirits and spectres reign. There you find clues to the missing links in the Doctor's experiments, the means to resurrect Jaja and destroy the evil animating him. But Jaja was merely one manifestation of the darkness, and in the fishing town of Shadowcrest, another witch, sister to she who resided in New Orleans, is performing a summoning of her own. Shadowcrest had always been a convenient port of call for smugglers and pirates and other unsavoury seamen, and hundreds of years ago, Captain Acarius was perhaps the worst of the lot. A bloody-handed reaver of insatiable greed, Acarius plundered much wealth in his lifetime, whether from the treasure ships of colonial empires or the golden temples of island natives. At the end of his life, Acarius hid his riches and hired a witch to enchant his own eye with eternal vigilance, encasing the eye in a gem that would thereafter watch over his hidden bounty. Centuries later, in 1960, another seaborne explorer, Captain Marcos, received an anonymous letter revealing the location of Acarius' treasure, the Isle of the Dead. The letter claimed that the most valuable item amongst the hoard was a huge black gem, and Marcos set off in search of the treasure. When he returned, black gem in hand, he brought with him the curse of Acarius, unleashing the servants of Shadow upon Shadowcrest. Marcos was no Acarius. He had friends, such as Dr. Benza, whose daughter Tia was infatuated with Marcos. But after touching the black gem, Marcos was slowly transformed into a bloodthirsty monster, preying upon the people of the town and remaking Shadowcrest into a den of madness and decay. Dr. Benza, cognizant of some terrible change being inflicted on the town, consulted a local gypsy and began to unravel the secret of the Eye of Acarius. By now Marcos had been driven almost completely insane, and slew Dr. Benza before he could try and destroy the eye. In a moment of lucidity, Marcos attempted to hang himself, but the doctor's daughter, ignorant of what was transpiring, wished upon a coin from the captain's treasure, believing it would save his life and banish the curse. The dark spirits twisted Tia's wish and gifted eternal on life to Marcos, who murdered the girl and continued his reign of terror. Today Shadowcrest is a ghost town, stalked by the shadow servants and haunted by the captain's victims. You find yourself drawn there by the power of the witch's summoning, who learned of your success in New Orleans and believes only a combination of logic, science, and spellcraft can prevail against Acarius' curse. She directs you to find some way of extracting the eye from the gem in which it is encased, after which she will use her magic to dispose of it safely. With your wits and your will, and the guidance of both the witch and the ghost of Tia, you overcome the evils of Shadowcrest and acquire the cursed eye. But what of the Isle of the Dead, the place of Icarius' hidden riches, where Captain Marcos lost his soul? Every dark tale has some darker and older origin, and the Curse of the Spirit's Eye was no exception. You travel from Shadowcrest to this ancient and remote island in search of answers, and find that darkness took root here long before Icarius set sail. In abandoned villas and colonial crypts, you uncover a story of tragedy and obsession, but one that reaches far back to the lost empire of Zolgyr, ruler of 100 island tribes. Zolgyr had a great tomb constructed to hold the wealth of his empire, and ordered the court mage, Tamarak, to lay a curse on the tomb to protect it against thieves. Tamarak ringed the tomb with the Bloodstones, gems made with the blood of the Emperor's daughter, and capable of summoning shadow creatures from the Black World. For a time, the threat of the curse was more than enough to deter intruders, but Zolgyr's empire was not eternal, and eons later, 7 legendary thieves came to plunder the tomb, unleashing Tamarak's curse, and with it, the creatures of the Black World. You trace the history of the curse, following the trail from archaeologists to explorers, and from there to grave robbers and ghosts, passing through shanty towns and abandoned cities on your quest for Zolgyr's tomb. Along the way, you confer with many colourful personalities, rival witches, a voodoo priestess, mysterious fortune tellers, and a mummified little girl, and at the end of your long journey, you lift the curse and defeat the darkness once again. But the darkness returns, and this time you are not the one to fight it. Billy Black arrives in the town of Antibes, a place little more civilized than the Isle of the Dead. Billy is searching for his missing fiancée, reporter Wendy Sothers, who was looking into several murders and the disappearance of a number of young women from out of town. Before she vanished, Wendy uncovered links between the girls and a local nightclub, a curious serpent tattoo, and a name, Sashia. Billy checks out Wendy's motel, where he finds signs of violence and the contact number for the nightclub. Bruce, the nightclub's shady owner, answers the call, and directs Billy to go downstairs and collect a videotape. On the tape is footage of Wendy at the mercy of 2 local toughs, with a warning that if Billy wants to see her alive again, he should return something Wendy stole from the nightclub. Billy begins investigating and learns that the whole town is effectively at the mercy of 2 powerful groups, Bruce's club and a secret society that uses the symbol of the serpent and strange green coins as a form of currency. Interrogating the few residents who haven't fled or disappeared, like a tattoo artist and a shifty pawnbroker, Billy learns that Bruce has been kidnapping young women, robbing them, and then sending them on to the enigmatic Sashia, apparently a witch of some kind who hides out in a mountain fortress. What Sashia could possibly want from the girls is a mystery, but it's unlikely a pleasant fate. As Billy draws closer to the truth of Bruce and Sashia's relationship, the bodies start to pile up. First some of the missing women, and then Bruce's own men. Every time a murder occurs, Billy glimpses something unnatural, shadows with glowing red eyes, a bedraggled hunchback, or a serpent that stalks Billy throughout the whole town. Eventually, 2 strange figures come to aid Billy in his quest. The first is the reclusive Tesla, whose daughter, a beautiful young woman with a talent for magic, disappeared long ago, soon after she was unwittingly gifted the green coins of the Serpent Society by her mother. The second is Daj, who claims that Antibes' knights are ruled by a vampiric cult, and that he leads a resistance group that uses both magic and science to hold the undead at bay. Whatever the truth, it's clear to Billy that every faction in Antibes has their own agenda, and if he wants to save Wendy, he'll need help from all of them, whether they give it willingly or not. What's remarkable about the last half of Darkness series is that for a franchise that ran for almost 20 years, there's actually very little connective tissue holding all the entries together. If you were expecting some kind of grand narrative that brings all the games under the umbrella of one great big shared universe, you'll be sorely disappointed. The links between the DOS games and the Reboot series are frayed at best, and even direct sequels are inconsistent with each other, sometimes retconning events or characters or rewriting elements of the shared background lore to accommodate new plot lines. In an interview with Adventure Classic Gaming, Fisher was asked if he viewed Last Half of Darkness as an episodic series, to which he replied in the negative, saying that though each game featured the same darkness, they were meant to explore many different forms and facets of that darkness and the way it touched various people and places. As far as a prevailing theme goes, that's pretty much the best you're going to get in trying to view the last half of Darkness series as a coherent body of work. Still, progressing through the series game by game, you do see certain elements crop up more than a few times, sometimes reasserting themselves with slight adjustments to fit the next plotline. The first 3 DOS games are a little unfocused in their storytelling and lore, as though the first game at least is an obvious homage to the haunted house genre, in both cinema and the graphic adventure. It's also a bit over-enthusiastic in how many classics it takes inspiration from. Ghosts or poltergeists are a natural fit for haunted house stories, but add to that vampires, hellhounds, crazed executioners, giant cobras, zombies, witchcraft, underground temples, and mad science, and already part 1 is less The Haunting and more The Monster Squad. The internal logic of the whole thing is also a little off, with the mysterious young girl and the unresolved question of your aunt's bizarrely specific powers of prescience. To what extent Last Half of Darkness is a horror will, I think, depend on both how old you were when you played it, and your stance on classic pulp comics like Tales of the Crypt or Vault of Horror. To many of us it seems a little ridiculous that anyone was frightened by a static screen showing a dime store slasher movie monster holding a crudely drawn heart. But there's no shortage of comments from older players with fond memories of booting up the game in the early 90s and leaping out of their skin every time they hit a game over, or employing it in furtherance of the noble tradition of bullying a sibling. I personally think the Last Half of Darkness series is much better at delivering on unsettling atmosphere than it is at evoking genuine fright, but you can tell from this first episode that Fisher was already firmly committed to the art of the jump scare. Much like Uninvited, Last Half of Darkness revels in inflicting gruesome and unexpected deaths on the player. There's not much to say about the second episode, as though a direct continuation of the story from the first, it seems to discard or sideline almost everything that was established in Last Half of Darkness. The aunt and the inheritance are of no relevance. The young girl exists, but the game declines to expound on her origin or importance, and the only other real connection to the first game is the recurring threat of the caretaker's dog in the maze. The new elements it introduces, undead card sharks, skeleton pirates and so on, all serve to drag the series further towards cheeky pastiche. I'd expect this sort of thing in the Goonies, but not a serious horror story. The third episode in the trilogy has an even more distant relationship to the original, as virtually all the characters and plot lines of the first 2 parts are dropped in favour of a new storyline with the Witch Sisters and the Ghoul Town. This may be partly due to it being unfinished. There are numerous red herrings and some rather baffling scenes that seem to be irrelevant to both gameplay and narrative. I think the mysterious girl from the first game is meant to be one of the Witch Sisters. Either that or the transforming dog that causes a game over when killed, but I've never seen the original manual, so who knows. And in fairness, I think it's slightly more consistent in tone than the second episode, even taking into account the gang of vampire punks, for example, as the central theme of the 3 sisters and the curse is the main focus of the story. Fisher apparently learned enough self-discipline not to go off on any wacky tangents this time. And I think the third episode is also when you start to see certain characters and plot points establish themselves as recurring features that last for the rest of the series. The mad experiments, the curse, the blending of witchcraft and science, allies of uncertain motivation, and sisters, either by blood or by pact. All of these return several times in future titles. The Romantic Blue reinforces some of these and adds a few tropes of its own that will also crop up again, but I think it deserves a lot of credit as a self-contained story too. This spin-off to the main series was to me by far the deepest, most atmospheric and memorable of the DOS-era games. Partly for the audio-visual factors I mentioned before, but also the characters themselves and how the story progresses. There's a tragic inevitability to the Romantic Blue, in how Morella's heartbreak and suicide is being retold through the younger sisters, how Miranda is inadvertently leading one stranger after another to their death in the crypts, and in particular how the inhabitants of Shadowcrest are picked off by the Shadow Servants as punishment for aiding the player and transgressing against the Sisterhood. By the time you reach the endgame, the whole town is practically devoid of life, and the finale isn't much cheerier. This could easily have been done in other mediums, but there's an added weight to their deaths when you know it's your actions that are indirectly the cause of their fate. It's not necessarily scarier than the original trilogy, though I certainly wasn't too comfortable wandering around the crypts, but it is more effective at pulling on the heartstrings. I mentioned earlier Romantic Blue had 2 endings that I'm aware of, one decidedly bittersweet, with the bitterness most prominent, and a secret ending that seems more optimistic but nevertheless ends on an ominous note. The first ending is probably most appropriate to a gothic horror love story, but it's also somewhat insulting considering all the work the player did to get there, so I'd actually judge the second ending more fitting repayment for my efforts. And those efforts did carry me through the story of the 2000 remake of Last Half of Darkness, so you might wonder why I didn't bother summarising its story. Well, there's really not much to say, it's fairly minimalistic, perhaps on the same level as the original episode, and what is there is mostly a retelling of the 1989 game, with certain elements swapped out in favour of bits and pieces of the later DOS titles. There is a large country estate, haunted by the ghost of a young woman, a black curse, an elixir to be brewed, a witch, and a labyrinth built under the family crypt. It's also a reminder that over 10 years after the original Last Half of Darkness, Fisher still likes his jump scares. I have a feeling that this was as much out of obligation as it was by conscious choice. The online version of Last Half of Darkness comes from a time when screamers were all the rage, when bored students or office workers used their work computer to play, loosely speaking, pixel hunt static background adventures, which liked to surprise the player with shock images and loud noises when they least expected it. Fisher's old website reminded me of the kind of places a younger me wasted time on in my school IT lab. I do wonder if this had the unfortunate side effect of making Fisher a bit too comfortable with the aforementioned jump scare tactic. You see criticisms of his reliance on this repeated across many different reviews of the more recent games. You'll recall that Last Half of Darkness 2000 was an iterative and transitional project rather than a single product though, and certain plot points, like a haunted doll or a painting that becomes a window to the Black World, ended up in Shadows of the Servants. As in gameplay and production values, the writing in Shadows would be the benchmark for the remaining games in the series. Once more, we see a lot of the older stories in Shadows. The trio of ghostly women, the science of blood magic, the ghastly shadow servants, the witches, and the summoning of a stranger to banish the darkness, though the details have been modified a bit. I was quite surprised by adventure gamers affectionately referring to the story as cheesy high-camp horror. True, this is a game where you have to clone a dead vampire monkey and then cast a voodoo spell to banish his shadow spirit. And if you compare Shadows to, say, Nucleos's Scratches, another haunted house point-and-click of the same era, the former's approach to horror might seem a bit juvenile. Where Scratches has an almost unbearably slow build-up to its scares, Shadows can barely contain itself for 20 minutes before ghosts are teleporting up your nose and skeletons are randomly popping out of the walls. But Scratches represents a fairly extreme end of the spectrum when it comes to haunted house tales. Some might dispute whether half the game can be characterised as horror at all. Shadows, though criticised for its jump scares, is also skilled at plucking at the player's nerves via more subtle methods. Besides, in comparison to the original DOS trilogy, to sentient volcanoes and talking dogs, ghostly galleons and ghoulish TV sitcoms, the reboot games are fairly serious and reserved, and don't treat horror or mad science tropes as a buffet table where you just grab whatever strikes your fancy. I liked how Shadows and subsequent entries justify the in-game puzzles by explaining that clues and key items are being actively concealed from shadow creatures and thieves, who would destroy or steal them if they were sitting around in plain sight. The reboots are also more dedicated to fleshing out their stories through cutscenes, NPC interaction, and journals, and though not so story-driven as some graphic adventures, particularly those of the late 2000s and beyond, their narratives and characters are far more engaging than any of the older episodes, aside from the Romantic Blue. That doesn't mean they're perfect, of course. Gordon Applin of Metro Magic felt that the characters in Shadows of the Servants were a little undeveloped, particularly the second of Moretta's daughters. I had similar feelings as Applin, and Beyond the Spirit's Eye didn't really resolve those issues. If anything, it showed that Fisher has always prioritised writing what happened to interest him at that point in time, rather than maintaining any sort of canon or continuity across the series. Though Spirit's Eye was characterised in some places as a return to the town of Shadowcrest, last seen in Romantic Blue, it's not clear whether there's much connection between the two Shadowcrests beyond the name and apparently incidental similarities between certain characters and plot points. The two towns are in fact in two totally different countries, and though to some extent history seems to be playing itself out once more with the witches, the shadow servants, the summoning, and a young girl's love causing things to go astray, if there was any sort of recognition of this in-game I never came across it. Even as an immediate canonical sequel to Shadow of the Servants, there's only a handful of direct links between the last game and Spirit's Eye, and even here certain established facts, like the nature of the Shadow Servants or the Black World, seem to have been retconned without explanation. It doesn't help that characters are sometimes vague or inconsistent about what artifact or supernatural force they're referring to. The terms shadows and guardians sometimes mean specific entities, or are sometimes used more liberally to denote seemingly any of the monsters related to the curse, and the precise timeline of events leading up to when the player is summoned don't really line up across all the different journal entries, cutscenes, and NPC dialogue. One thing that did make the trip between games unscathed were the jump scares, which again came in for criticism from some reviews I read. Deserved, in my opinion. But again, it's balanced with more effective, slow burn scares, by which I mean showing some level of restraint instead of throwing screamers at the player every second screen. In the interests of even-handedness, I should also mention the jump scares in the reboot games weren't universally panned. Steve Ramsey felt they were actually very cleverly paced, and Melanie Greeley of Adventure Gamers said Spirit's Eye sometimes made her jump out of her chair without resorting to gore or other cheap thrills. I noticed this latter point about foregoing violence or extreme content in general was mentioned in some other reviews. Wendy Nellius of Adventure Lantern, for example, praised Shadows of the Servants for bucking the trend of horror games using blood and gore as a substitute for imagination or immersion. Whilst anyone can appreciate horror games that try to do something different, I'm not sure that's really the case with the Last Half of Darkness series. Rather, I think it's linked to the point we considered earlier, about the target demographic of point-and-click adventures being separate from the, let's say, hardcore gamer crowd. It might seem strange to those of us who've burned out our dopamine receptors with a steady diet of twitchy action games, salty language, and extreme violence, but there's a portion of adventure gamers who don't like mainstream action games. Not only because they dislike real-time action gameplay, but because there's a limit to how much horror they want from their horror games. Without sounding too condescending, there's no doubt that a good number of the people Fisher was targeting with this series have a very low threshold when it comes to scary content. I think there's more to that than violence, though. Horror is as much bound up in sex or subversion as it is blood and gore, and there's none of that in the Last Half of Darkness series. Despite the curses and torture and death and all that, it's actually a very family-friendly kind of horror. I don't recall any suggestion of racism or sexual violence or social commentary. The riskiest thing you'll see in the entire franchise is the neckline on Miranda's dress. In one interview, Fisher said he used his teenage nephew to beta test his games, and I definitely class the Reboot series as perfectly safe for both teenagers and players who aren't interested in material that's too unpleasant or controversial. Nor should that be a black mark against the series. God knows I have zero interest in so-called elevated horror. It's just that there's nothing especially novel about Fisher's approach to the genre. It merely imitates horror stories with less sensitive subject matter. The final game in the Reboot trilogy, Tomb of Zolgyr, stayed mostly true to this. Its horror is again mostly surface level, with monstrous creatures lurking in the dark and the odd dead body lying about. As the third game in what is ostensibly supposed to be a canonical trilogy, it's also one of the most narratively muddled. Once again, the player is supposed to be the same person as the protagonist of the previous two games, with the plot continuing directly on from the ending of Spirit's Eye. But again, it's written as if by someone who was only partially familiar with or had forgotten the events of the last two games. The ending of the last game seems to have been slightly revised. Most of the important characters dropped, and elements of the backstory and lore again rewritten in ways that conflict with material from previous episodes. And unless I was misreading things, it can't even keep its own writing straight. On one page of a journal, it says the Emperor Zolgyr was buried in 1651, and specifically mentions the medieval era, and on the next page it says the tomb was robbed 2,000 years after it was built, which would presumably place the events of the game sometime in the distant future. And there are little mistakes in other places, like misspelled names. That's a minor complaint though, it was the constant revisions to the backstory that bothered me, as someone playing through the three games one after another. Fisher does retain or reintroduce some elements from earlier stories. The spider symbolism, the voodoo, gypsies and witches, cursed gemstones, haunted dolls, the black world and the monstrous servants. But it seems strange there are so few recurring characters across Shadows, Spirit's Eye and Zolgyr, particularly since some characters in one game have an almost identical role to those from the previous title, to the point I was sometimes unsure whether it was a different character or not. In Melanie Greeley's review, some characters in Zolgyr were criticised as seeming out of place or extraneous to the narrative, though I wasn't clear on whether she meant they were thematically incompatible with the setting, or that their role in the story wasn't properly explained. Obviously, the argument can be made that Fisher wanted to tell new stories with different character dynamics in each game, which is definitely better than recycling characters without giving them any sort of arc. But for the most part, the cast of this trilogy, both recurring characters and those who only appear for one game, are all very shallow and undeveloped. One or two have an ulterior motive to helping the player, others have no particular motivation at all, and their backstories don't converge in a satisfying conclusion at the end of the trilogy. If you took out all the lines that state a direct connection between Zolgyr and the previous games, of which there aren't that many, most would assume the last half of Darkness series was just an anthology of independent narratives that all happen to share vaguely similar themes. It feels like the idea of there being direct continuity between these three games was just something tacked on at the end, which it wasn't, it's just this continuity is weak and inconsistent. The only two real constants are Madame Zahira, who takes a somewhat important role in both Spirit's Eye and Tomb of Zolgyr, and the protagonist, who is the same person in all three games. Madame Zahira is not all that interesting, and isn't really developed all that much outside of Spirit's Eye anyway. The protagonist is worth mentioning because they're a direct stand-in for the player, and this fact was an important one for reviewers when the final game, Society of the Serpent Moon, replaced them. I already mentioned the immediate relevance of playing horror games from a silent first-person perspective versus controlling a character from afar, but for some reviewers, the on-scene and on-speaking protagonist also enabled them to, in the loosest sense of the word, roleplay as that character. In her Serpent Society review, Astrid Buelink said it was easier to imagine oneself in the same situation when the player was represented by a faceless and formless avatar. By introducing the character of Billy Black, Fisher had undermined a key strength of the series, which, according to Buelink, wasn't helped by the fact that Black was an excessively stoic and, in her words, impassive character. Flotsam of Game Boomers was fonder of Black, saying, "If I were Wendy, I'd want someone like Billy looking for me," but agreed that the change of protagonist left them feeling more distant. I wouldn't say the last half of Darkness series was entirely committed to the protagonist being a self-insert for the player. Even the first episode had a tiny bit of established background for the protagonist, and although I don't think it's ever explicitly stated whether they're supposed to be male or female, there are certain little tells throughout the series. In the DOS games there's the young virgin girl and the rash of beautiful young women in skimpy clothing, and in the Reboot series the player is always summoned by or encounters some unmistakably feminine damsel in distress. Still, broadly speaking, the protagonist of these games is you. There's no barrier between the character in-game and the person sitting in their underwear with the lights off in the real world. You are at least wearing underwear, I hope. Going off memory, I don't think any of the reviews I read of Serpent Society said they preferred the character of Billy Black over the self-insert protagonist of previous titles. They weren't especially critical of the character. As I mentioned before, most of the negativity was directed towards the voice acting. But those that compared the two approaches, even those who liked Billy, agreed Serpent Moon was less immersive. There are obviously a number of potential benefits to using a clearly defined independent character as the protagonist. In a dialogue-driven game like Serpent Moon, one such benefit would be the interplay between the protagonist and the characters he meets along the way. I'm not sure this is all that evident in Billy's case, though. There's nothing especially tense, funny, or engaging about his interactions with the rest of the cast. At best, I guess you can credit Fisher for making it seem that, despite his cool demeanour, Billy does care about his fiancée, and as a third-party observer you're invested in his success. I think it helps that once you leave the motel at the start of the game, you have pretty much no idea what's happening to Wendy right up until the final scene. I suppose some might say this undermined the sense of urgency in rescuing her, but I think it works very well in Serpent Society due to a couple of interconnected factors. One is that Serpent Society is slightly darker than previous games in the last half of Darkness series, with the evil Billy facing being as much human as it is supernatural. Although there's a certain ambiguity to it, the scheme hatched by the antagonists is basically a depressingly familiar tale of young girls being drugged, branded, brainwashed, and sold on as, quote, fresh meat. The second is that though Wendy is characterised as smart and vaguely streetwise, at the end of the day she's still the perfect picture of the blonde-haired, fair-skinned maiden at the mercy of her captors. As Billy delves into Antibes' seedy underbelly, he starts finding the corpses of used-up nightclub girls or the friends or relatives who tried to save them, and learns of how Wendy tried to infiltrate the operation by following in their footsteps. Learning all these sordid and dirty details whilst never knowing what's happening to Wendy creates a far more compelling incentive to find her than randomly splicing in cutscenes of Wendy being mishandled by henchmen. And the closer Billy gets to the truth, the greater the sense of impending dread. Unfortunately, I think this feeling has almost completely evaporated by the time you reach the final area, which, not coincidentally, is when the rather mundane corruption and criminality of Antibes' underworld has been supplanted by a more fantastical foe. Serpent Society may feature a more plausible and coherent setting than the original DOS trilogy, but it does inevitably turn into Saturday Fright Night, as Laura MacDonald put it, with witch, vampire, snake monsters and the like. Still, it's quite an effective means of motivating both Billy and, hopefully, the player, at least while exploring Antibes by night. This, I think, is a better example of Adventure Gamer's point about horror games having more tools at their disposal than blood and guts, instilling anxiety and fear through implication rather than garish violence. The idea that Wendy could well be one in a long line of vulnerable young women chewed up and spat out by the underworld. On that point of Antibes After Dark, it reminded me a little of Shadowcrest in Romantic Blue. On one level, this is because in both cases the exact location of these places is somewhat inconsistent. I read online that Romantic Blue was supposed to be set in colonial-era America, but the in-game manual seems to indicate that it's in Europe. Obviously complicated even further by Spirit's Eye introducing a Louisiana-based Shadowcrest. Similarly, marketing material from Iceberg Interactive states that Serpent Society's Antibes is supposed to be in Europe. Adventure Gamer's review says the same, as does material in retail copies of the game, whilst other sources say it's in Louisiana or thereabouts. The latter seems more likely based on how it's depicted in-game, so I don't know if there was a mix-up with the game's publisher, or it was originally meant to be set in Europe, but Fisher realised how silly this would seem. The other way in which it reminded me of Romantic Blue was in how Billy interacts with the locals. I mentioned already that Serpent Society was a bit disappointing in this area in terms of gameplay, as there's not much critical thinking involved in the actual dialogue. But in terms of their personalities and how Billy deals with them, it definitely felt like a throwback to 1994, in that you're conversing with a variety of furtive and suspicious characters. In Serpent Society, a few have to be confronted with evidence of their role in Wendy's disappearance before they give up their secrets. Others, like the tattoo artist, were especially reminiscent of the townsfolk in Romantic Blue, at first reluctant to aid the player but eventually giving in to their better nature. This wasn't quite as effective as in the DOS game though, in which many of these poor souls do in fact face immediate retribution from the servants. I suppose that's partly due to the difference between how Fisher characterises Shadowcrest and Antibes. Shadowcrest is a bleak place because of Morella, the magical blue elixir, and the black curse, and the story is leading towards a definitive resolution in which, one way or another, the curse of Shadowcrest is lifted, no matter the cost. In Serpent Society, on the other hand, Antibes is not a bad place merely because of magic or vampires or curses. It's mostly the product of criminals, corrupt officials, and destitute drifters, and finding Wendy won't change that. In fact, based on the ending, it's not clear whether finding Wendy was worth doing in the first place. The final cutscene, and in particular the post-credits dialogue, suggest Billy was too tardy in his investigation, strongly implying that you were too slow or did something wrong. But I'm not aware of an alternative ending to Serpent Society, so this just seems like a bit of a slap in the face, even worse than the ending of Romantic Blue, which could at least be said to be thematically fitting. And as with Tomb of Zolgyr, it has no bearing on the stories of the other Last Half of Darkness games. I'm not sure which is worse, Zolgyr for not doing much with 3 games worth of potential build-up, or Serpent Society for not being a particularly memorable epitaph for a 20-year-long franchise. It didn't really feel like a send-off for a whole series, more like a long-running but rudderless sitcom that more or less tied up its last season and was then quietly cancelled, with neither fanfare nor much gnashing of teeth at unresolved plot lines. I know it probably wasn't intended as such. I suspect Fisher just felt like doing another graphic adventure and wasn't trying to position it as the finale 20 years in the making or anything like that. But at the time of writing, that's what it ended up as. And in those 20 years, I think there was certainly some competent writing, but also a lot of missed opportunities. By his own admission, Fisher wasn't trying to weld 9 games worth of stories into one narrative, just explore different ideas each time, and in that I think all the games did as well as could be expected. The only exceptions from that would be the second episode, which was almost totally unmoored from anything approaching a consistent setting or story, the third episode, which was seemingly unfinished, and the 2000 remake, which didn't have much of a story at all. The rest of the series, the original, the Romantic Blue, the Reboot trilogy, and Serpent Society, are all reasonably satisfying as self-contained episodes, and I was genuinely invested in some of them. Still, I think that those games that were canonical sequels were a bit haphazardly plotted, to the point that Fisher perhaps needn't have bothered trying to relate them to each other in the first place. And even if we think of Last Half of Darkness as some sort of anthology of very loosely connected Monster of the Week stories, it still would have been possible for each game to explore some of the same themes in interesting ways. There are many recurring elements across the various episodes, but I don't think they're much more interesting to consider as a whole than they are individually. I think it's a shame, for example, Fisher didn't lean into the theme of sibling rivalry between sisters, which is hinted at in a couple of titles, or his portrayal of damsels in distress summoning a succession of strangers to their doom, like an amalgam of chivalric legend and film noir femme fatales, fair-featured black widows seducing knights in shining armour into webs of death and deceit. I also noticed Fisher seems to have a preoccupation with voodoo witchcraft, or more specifically its influence on Louisiana. Although it's frequently brought up, it always seems a very shallow, surface-level depiction, which might be fine for horror movies, but could have used some depth if it's going to be a key part of the plot in a 7 or 8 hour adventure game. Speaking from the perspective of someone who doesn't really know anything about the topic, I think it would have been a really interesting subject to delve into in more detail, and Fisher already makes some use of its rituals in the puzzles and minigames, so that could have been expanded on. Overall though, I think Fisher did enough to establish a creepy and unnerving atmosphere, and populated his worlds with a good balance of menacing, cryptic, sympathetic, and even dangerously alluring characters that all fit the setting. If I had to pick a favourite for the writing, I'd probably go with Romantic Blue for its tragic underpinnings, or Shadows of the Servants just for being the most consistent and competently told, but the other Reboot games also had individual elements I liked, particularly the last one. Of course, some might prefer the original trilogy for their panegyrical treatment of classic haunted house and monster mash horror, or Serpent Society for its sordidness and more modern approach to storytelling. Which is the great thing about a franchise that ran for so long and tried so many different approaches. For no matter whether it's the kitschy glory of the DOS trilogy, the gothic allure of Romantic Blue, or the forbidding ambience of the Reboot games, there's something familiar here for almost any fan of horror.
It won't be long now. I can sense the presence of the servants. Lurking, waiting in dusk's shadows for the stranger soon to come.
Circa 2005, a common sentiment expressed by reviewers of Last Half of Darkness was that, love it or hate it, graphic adventure fans didn't have a whole lot of alternatives. The market was barely clinging to life, and increasingly ignored or relegated to back-page filler by mainstream reviewers. If you wanted to play a traditional point-and-click adventure, you were in no position to turn your nose up at Bill Fisher's work. It's no coincidence that if you look at some of the names peripherally involved in the Last Half of Darkness series, beta testers or reviewers for example, you'll see some of those same names pop up in the credits for other horror-themed adventures, like Scratches, Barrow Hill, Darkness Within, and a few others. The point-and-click adventure scene in the mid to late 2000s was naturally a bit incestuous. It was too small to be otherwise. Today that's not quite the case, as certain adventure games, namely the interactive drama, have entered the mainstream and are backed by big publishers and high production values. Even the point-and-click genre has made a bit of a comeback, sometimes championed by graphic adventure luminaries from a bygone era, other times developed by small indie studios and proliferating through digital distribution platforms like Steam and elsewhere. So has the Last Half of Darkness series outlived its relevance? Was it merely a sip of brackish water for thirsty adventure fans who, in the early to mid-2000s, had no fresher alternatives? I don't think so, at least for fans of point-and-click adventures. The market in this day and age is undoubtedly healthier than in the mid-2000s, but many of the games categorised as graphic adventures today are very different to those of 20 years ago. Games like Shadows of the Servants or Tomb of Zolgyr were oriented towards traditional point-and-click mechanics, with non-linear exploration and plenty of puzzles and mini-games of at least intermediate difficulty. Even Society of the Serpent Moon, the most streamlined and accessible of the series, requires a modicum of critical thinking and remains firmly committed to the same kind of experience as the previous games. The modern market is full of games that stray far from this formula. Walking simulators, glorified visual novels, action adventures, or narrative-focused adventures in which the puzzles are so simple as to be mere formalities. Some players, indeed based on sales probably a majority, actually prefer these to traditional point-and-click gameplay. And it's not as if more conservative games that harken back to the good old days aren't being made for graphic adventure revanchists. But adventure games like Last Half of Darkness aren't so ubiquitous that individual entries can be ignored. To say they're still an endangered species wouldn't be entirely hyperbolic. Rather, their numbers have recovered enough that healthier specimens can be prioritised over less worthwhile ones. Into which category does Last Half of Darkness fall? Well, I think the DOS-era games are kind of on the weaker side. The first episode is a reasonably good example of the point-and-click haunted house adventure, but it is a shareware game, and thus is quite short and weak in the areas of graphics, sound and narrative in comparison to full-price horror games of its day. The second and third episodes are also quite buggy or incomplete, and in production values fall even further behind commercial releases of the era. The Romantic Blue is, in my opinion, much more interesting, but still doesn't quite feel like a game that could have competed in the market in 1994. The Reboot series, though, definitely holds up against rivals of the day. Despite contemporary criticisms of some fuzzy audio and grainy FMV, as Myst clones go, they're good-looking and fantastically atmospheric. Whilst obviously made on a budget, you wouldn't necessarily be able to compare them to similar games released around the same time and know which was developed by a studio and which was developed by one guy. The real-time 3D models in Society of the Serpent Moon have dated a bit faster than the earlier three games, but on the whole it still does a great job capturing Antibes' creepy and corrupt underworld. By no means can I guarantee that people who find traditional point-and-click adventures boring will somehow fall in love with the Last Half of Darkness series. But I can say they're some of the better examples of the genre, avoiding many of the common pitfalls that turn players off, whilst not streamlining things so far that they're no longer challenging. If you can't imagine yourself spending 30 minutes on a pipe puzzle, then, well, I'll admit Last Half of Darkness is still that type of game. And those who enjoy more involving, action-focused horror, such as survival horror fans, won't find that here, as although the Reboot games can be tense or even downright chilling, mechanically they're closer to Mystery Case Files hidden object games than they are Penumbra or Resident Evil. But if there's any room in your cold heart for classic adventure gaming, I recommend giving the Reboot games a chance. You can find Society of the Serpent Moon, which seems to be DRM free and is bundled with Shadows of the Serpents, Beyond the Spirit's Eye, and Tomb of Zolgyr for $5 on Steam, and it frequently drops to $2 or $3 during sales. If you're looking for other titles similar to the Last Half of Darkness series, there are several options depending on which game in the series you're interested in. The original DOS episodes of course owe their existence to ICOM's Uninvited, which, though widely considered abandonware, was re-released in 2015 and put on Steam. Just be aware it is a game from 1986, and modern reviewers were none too keen on its unforgiving and sometimes obtuse mechanics. If you can stomach it, you might also consider getting it as part of a bundle including a number of other ICOM classics, like Deja Vu and Shadowgate. For those intrigued by the Romantic Blues blend of point-and-click gameplay and dungeon crawling, you might want to try Horrorsoft's Elvira series, either the two Elvira games from 1990 and 1991, which can be found on Good Old Games, but controversially only in the form of the DOS versions, or their spiritual successor, 1992's Waxworks, which some consider superior. Though the series is slightly more tongue-in-cheek than Last Half of Darkness, it still features more than a few scares, a much bigger budget, deeper combat mechanics, and is no slouch in the puzzle department either. Moving on to the Reboot series, there are quite a few first-person point-and-click horror games of a similar nature, with the best known, and easiest to buy today, probably being Nucleos's Scratches or Jonathan Boke's Dark Fall of the Journal. Both involve a heavy emphasis on puzzles, exploration, and atmosphere, and can be picked up from Steam or GOG, with the long-running Darkfall series last updated in 2020 with Darkfall Ghost Vigil. Finally, Serpent Society is one of many point-and-click games featuring a third-person camera and heavy NPC interaction, but those specifically interested in horror and detective work will probably enjoy Microid's Still Life series, starting with Post Mortem in 2003 and followed up with Still Life in 2005 and Still Life 2 in 2009, all three of which are available on GOG. These will appeal to those who still enjoy puzzles and spooky atmosphere, but prefer a little more NPC interaction and cinematic storytelling to keep things moving. And that about wraps up today's video. I'd like to thank all my subscribers, and of course any of you who stumbled across this video by accident and inexplicably watched it all the way to the end. And a special thanks to Bill Fisher himself, who kindly took the time to answer some of my queries about the series and clear up some misconceptions regarding dates and different versions and such. I originally intended to do this video solely on the Romantic Blue, but I'm not exactly the biggest expert on graphic adventures, so I decided to do a broad overview of the whole franchise instead. The last half of Darkness series is quite unique in having lasted so long but always remaining in the hands of the same developer. The same one person, in fact. It's sort of like a controlled study in seeing how a specific subgenre of graphic adventure, the point-and-click horror, changed over the course of 20 years. I hope you found it interesting, in spite of my ignorance on the subject. If you have any thoughts on Last Half of Darkness, be it the 1989 game or the 2011 swan song of the series, or want to recommend similar games that I didn't mention in this video, be sure to leave a comment. As for my next video, we'll be returning to the Hero Quest franchise to take a look at Gremlin Interactive.